Chapter 989 Mentor Alger. Upon hearing the moon's question, the rest of the Tarot Club members realized that the main instigator for the punishment had ended up with nothing to do. According to the established plan, all he needed to do was provide the name, address, and appearance before waiting for the outcome. Misjudgment was in charge of tracking and investigations to figure out the target's patterns. Miss Justice and Mr. Star would then choose a suitable location based on the feedback before Mr. Star threw the sanguine into an unconscious state without attracting any attention. Miss Justice would then take this opportunity to complete a hypnotism act and make the target proceed to the predetermined location. In this entire process, there was nothing for the moon. Audrey deliberated and said, "Mr. Moon, what you need to do is to ensure that the hypnotized sanguine doesn't encounter any accidents on the way to the cathedral, without him struggling or being rescued." Upon saying that, Audrey suddenly realized a problem in the plan as she hurriedly added, "If that sanguine is extremely resistant towards the Church of Mother Earth, the hypnotic effects wouldn't be as effective. Therefore, I plan on avoiding this point if possible. I will imbue in him the thought of nabbing some target he hates so that he wouldn't realize that he's entering the intended cathedral during the pursuit. How about letting you be the target of his hatred? This will require you to be able to ensure your own safety while maintaining a distance without being caught." "It's not a problem," Emlyn answered after some thought. With Duke Ulmer removing the mental corruption of the Sequence 5 artificial vampire Beyonder characteristic, Emlyn just needed to wait till a full moon to become a Viscount. That would place him equal to Ernst Boyar. And this opportunity was available next week. When that happened, he didn't believe that he would be caught up to by a Viscount just like him when he was equipped with the Ancestor's Ring. "If it really won't work, I can borrow Miss Magician's spellbook. I recall that there are powers in the wind domain." Emlyn was rather confident. By the side, Leonard felt a baffling sense of horror when he heard the conversation between Miss Justice and Mr. Moon. To him, no matter how terrifying a head-on battle was, it was nothing compared to the horror of doing something that went against his own will without him realizing it. He paused for a moment and replied to the second problem that Emlyn had raised. "My payment is the same as misjudgment. I want a portion of the spoils." To Leonard, this entire matter required him to determine the time and location to pull the target into a dream before he left. He didn't need to care if the operation was successful or if any accidents cropped up. It was as simple as heading to a coffee shop to order a cup of Desi coffee. The only thing that needed him to take into account was to not expose himself. Therefore, he couldn't bring himself to ask for an advanced payment, planning to obtain a cut from the final spoils of war. In addition, he believed that this was a necessary thing to do in order to fully blend in with the Tarot Club. He didn't need to nitpick on such matters. Audrey turned her head and glanced at Zio before retracting her gaze. Revealing a smile, she said, "My request is the same as Mr. Star and Miss Judgment. I'll take a quarter of the spoils of war." In fact, she wasn't insistent on getting payment, because she believed that the Sanguine had bullied a Tarot Club member and her two friends. Punishing him was something she expected of herself. The reason why she took a portion of the spoils of war was to take into account Mr. Moon's feelings. She was afraid that her voluntary help would leave the prideful Sanguine embarrassed and angry. Furthermore, Mr. Moon doesn't have any money, so the payment can only be the spoils of war. Audrey added silently. Although she didn't deliberately keep count, based on her ability to take note of details and the memory of a spectator, she believed that Mr. Moon, who had spent £5,000 to purchase the Sequence 5 artificial vampire Beyonder characteristic, wasn't in the best financial state. Furthermore, he had to refund the intel fee that he earned for participants, with each obtaining a piece of the spoils of war. "That's very fair." Emlyn nodded and surveyed the area. "Any other suggestions?" Furs asked in disbelief. "It's that simple?" "That's a Sanguine equivalent to a Sequence 5. The plan you came up with sounds like it would succeed very easily." In her mind, Sequence 5 Beyonders were the strongest among unaffiliated Beyonders. Some were even the host of gatherings. Even the powerful pirate admirals were of that sequence, but now, in the conversation of the Star and the others, such a sequence 5 was to be finished so simply. There didn't seem to be any difficulties. Upon hearing her question, Leonard thought and said, as long as that sanguine doesn't have any items that resist my powers, even if he's equivalent to a sequence 5, I'll definitely be able to throw him into an unconscious state for some time. It will just depend on Miss Justice to grasp this opportunity. If I arrange the location and make preparations ahead of time, I'll be fine, Audrey replied in a confirmatory tone. She was actually a little uneasy. After all, this was her first time in battle, but her confidence over her beyonder powers and knowledge in psychological mysticism allowed her to say those words with confidence. After Furs heard the response, she suddenly felt her mind a little adrift. Without realizing it, apart from Mr. World, the rest of the Tarot Club members have the ability to finish off Sequence 5 Beyonders as well. That's right. Miss Justice is already a Sequence 6 hypnotist. With the cooperation of a Beyonder of the same level, there really is a relatively high chance of hypnotizing a Sequence 5 Beyonder. Just as Emlyn felt that this matter had been settled without needing any more questions to be raised, Alger, who had been observing from the side, spoke. As members of a secret organization, I believe that everything needs to be considered at a deeper level. Emlyn and Leonard cast their gaze at Mr. Hanged Man with a puzzled look. Audrey and Zio were taken aback before they realized something. Alger cleared his throat and looked at Derek. Since Delaire Forest's abandoned ancient castle was a test, why isn't the obvious sanguine a test as well? Exactly. I knew that Mr. Hanged Man would have given a warning. The fool Klein controlled the world. Gehrman Sparrow to nod. Catlia then looked at the Hanged Man with a look of approval and agreement. This. Emlyn's pupils constricted, at a loss for a retort. In an instant, he found himself too careless. Leonard was taken aback. Immediately, he realized that he was too desultory. He had involved himself without fully understanding the details and without consideration of any latent risks. Of course, this style had to do with his identity as an official Beyonder and its thought processes. As expected of Mr. Hanged Man. He considers all the details with such meticulousness. Audrey, you need to build up more experience. Audrey focused on something else as she asked, so we need to abandon the punishment and take action when the sanguine are unable to maintain the secret surveillance? Alger chuckled and said, there's no need to. Just a few acts of misdirection would do. He then looked at Emlyn and said, first, hand the investigation of the sanguine to bounty hunters in Backland. Use their existence to hide misjudgment's actions. Second, when determining the location, try to do it near an Orthodox deity's cathedral. This will effectively disrupt any subsequent divinations. Third, before Miss Justice and the others take action, you have to do something that leaves one suspicious but is nothing eye-catching. Make it seem like you will be exacting revenge somewhere else so as to attract the eyeballs of the secret monitor away, thus, creating the desired opportunity. This is combined with the first point. Fourth, only after the sanguine is successfully hypnotized do you become the bait. Having said that, Alger paused. If there's the addition of anti-divination and anti-prophecy at the demigod level, this entire matter will be flawless. Of course, Miss Justice, Mr. Star, you must be disguised during the operation, without leaving behind any traces. This speech left most of the members taken aback, especially Derek. He couldn't help show his respect and amazement. Although he had no means of participating in this punishment operation, as a member of the Tarot Club, he couldn't help but be concerned and pensive about such matters that required a clear line of thought. He hadn't noticed any problems with the original plan of Mr. Moon and company, so now, he couldn't help but be impressed by Mr. Hanged Man's ability in such matters. Emlyn thought and said, you mean that I should use a superficial form of punishment to hide Miss Justice's and Mr. Star's secret operation? It's like. It's like I would make it appear that I'll take action in a particular corner of a square after the target leaves a coffee shop, attracting all the attention, but in actual fact, Miss Justice and company would have already completed the hypnosis inside the coffee shop without anyone realizing it? Alger nodded gently. That's right. I learned something new. Mr. Hanged Man really is an experienced beyonder. Audrey felt overjoyed receiving an epiphany. The problem now is, where are we to find an item or charm with anti-divination and anti-prophecy effects at the demigod level? Leonard also felt that he had enriched himself greatly as he asked. He wasn't too worried about himself since he had an angel grandpa in him. Furs made an utterance before saying, I can lend out Lamino's Travels. On it there's Angel's Embrace. I can also take one portion of the spoils of war. As she said that, she secretly glanced at the World Gehrman Sparrow, heaving a sigh of relief when he saw the gentleman silent. Unbeknownst to her, the fool Klein had a very simple thought: Angel's Embrace. That sounds so much better than Paper Angel. With the punishment operation finally confirmed, Audrey didn't hesitate as she surveyed the area. I met the psychology alchemist's counselor, Vin Rambus, last week. What? Vin Rambus is a counselor of the psychology alchemists? Leonard sat up in surprise. He had the urge to immediately report it to the Archbishop and gather a team to arrest him. It was an occupation hazard. Chapter 990 Inner Fears. Almost instinctively, Leonard looked around the table and realized that none of the other Tarot Club members showed any hint of surprise. Instead, they were listening attentively. They knew of it long ago? That's right. This is only my second gathering. I haven't had the chance to learn about many things. The secrets that get exchanged here sure are plentiful. Leonard retracted his gaze and returned to his original sitting posture. After a slight pause, Audrey glanced at Zio, who sat 2 seats away from her, before casting her gaze at Mr. Hanged Man. She continued, he attempted to cue me to interact with different nobles and understand their true attitude over different matters. I would then inform him of them. Thankfully, Mr. Fool had provided me with the blessings of an angel. So I wasn't influenced in any way. What should I do next? You can even get blessings from an angel? Leonard looked around in surprise once more, only to see no reaction from the other members of the Tarot Club. Obviously, he wasn't surprised that Mr. Fool had a few angels in existence under him. After all, the name and title corresponding to Death Consul was one that he had heard numerous times. He was just surprised that the Tarot Club members were able to pray for assistance at that level. He viewed this secret organization in a new light, finding it more impressive. Meanwhile, Zio keenly caught onto a few keywords: noble, psychology alchemists. Combining it with the blonde hair, emerald green eyes of Miss Justice's blurry figure, she began to connect it to a particular friend, Audrey Hall. However, she couldn't be sure because blonde hair, black hair, blue eyes, and green eyes were common among the lone nobles. People just had different combinations. Besides, no one knew how many members the psychology alchemists had developed in the noble circles. Therefore, Zio couldn't directly point it at Miss Audrey from the traits she noticed. As she tried to do a deeper level of observation, Alger had said, there's no need to pay too much attention to this. The various Orthodox churches will provide protective measures to their believers with a rather important status. They will prevent them from being assassinated or hypnotized. This comes from experience that has been built up over 1,000 years of history. It wouldn't be that easily overcome. From another angle, if the psychology alchemists really can control the nobles that simply by hypnotizing them, the ones ruling the country wouldn't be the royal family and the 3 churches. Clearly, reality is in conflict with that. Yes, just as you said, Vin Rambus only gave you a cue to observe the true attitudes of the different nobles on different matters. This means that he's holding himself back greatly, afraid of doing anything too overboard. It's to prevent himself from leaving behind any clues. In addition, your true status among the nobles should just be in the periphery. You have no way of directly involving yourself in various political matters. Therefore, in contrast, the protection and monitoring over you wouldn't be too strict. This is also why Vin Rambis targeted you. Mr. Hanged Man's analysis is really detailed. Although he often taught Little Sun and the others, he would secretly gain something during the process, wishing that he could get more useful information from the feedback. However, there's none of that this time. It's the same for the suggestions for the punishment operation from before as well. On careful thought, his change has been happening for quite some time. It just wasn't too obvious in the past. I even missed out on it. Audrey's professionalism stirred up as she quickly did a mental analysis of the Hanged Man. She quickly had a theory, suspecting that Mr. Hanged Man was trying to transform his standing within the Tarot Club. Ever since Ma'am Hermit joined the Tarot Club and showcased her resources and channels at sea, Mr. Hanged Man has been unknowingly searching to transform himself in a bid to distinguish himself from her. Before problems cropped up with the artisan, this transformation wasn't that obvious. Even Mr. Hanged Man didn't realize it himself. It was only recently that he seemed to finally come to a realization and thought it to be true. Indeed, to maintain one's standing in the Tarot Club, the raising of one's strength is one aspect, but providing help to the entire group is another aspect. Audrey's mind raced as she turned her attention back to the topic at hand. She pondered for a moment and subconsciously, her tone turned heavy. Does this also mean that the Orthodox churches will have certain levels of surveillance, control, and guidance for the important nobles? This was something that she had thought about while in the Lone Charity Bursary Foundation's office. She had subconsciously drawn a scene that represented her concerns on this matter. In psychology, elements she drew out in such a state often didn't point to something particular. It was more like an abstract expression. The cold eyes mostly represented her fear for people monitoring and controlling her and her family. Combining it with her subconscious drawing, her worry of Vin Rambis's queuing, and the celebrant of the Mass at the Church of Evernight her parents attended being Baklan's Archbishop, Audrey's interpretation was that not only was she afraid of the hypnosis and cues of the psychology alchemists, but she had also become fearful of the Orthodox churches. She couldn't be sure if they would directly use their beyonder powers to imbue thoughts into aristocratic believers with high standings, so as to guide them into doing actions that violated their true will. This was sacrilegious and rebellious to Audrey, who had received an Orthodox education from a young age. Therefore, she had tensed up back then, immediately burning that drawing. After hearing Miss Justice's question, Alger scoffed. Isn't that very normal? When living in human society, one has to accept a certain level of surveillance, control, and guidance. I know what you're afraid of, but think about it. Compare someone using their power conferred from their standing, using money and weapons to control and guide others, to using beyonder powers to do something similar. In essence, is there any difference? The difference is that one knows that they don't wish to do it but ends up having to do it, the other is that they do not even have the thoughts of being unwilling to do it. Audrey nodded and said, yes, this means the loss of freedom of one's mind and thoughts. It's the most terrifying. Alger chuckled once more. How can there be a completely free mind and thoughts? By choosing your faith and beliefs, you're naturally bound by your faith and beliefs. Yes, let's focus only on the Lone Kingdom. The three churches are equal, and together with the royal family, this creates a balance between each other. If the Church of Storms goes overboard towards its believers, that believer can easily convert their faith to the Church of Evernight. Therefore, under most situations, the Orthodox churches will tend to use their standing and beliefs as a religion to guide important believers instead of using beyonder powers. Balance. Audrey pondered over this term. She came to a new realization of the kingdom's upper circles and the entire world. This was something she had come into contact with before but had never deeply understood the word. At this moment, many of her thoughts matured. Thank you for your explanation, Mr. Hanged Man. Audrey sincerely addressed him with an honorary title. Then, how should I deal with Vin Rambus? Alger calmly said, the problem with him isn't anything to panic about. You fully have the ability to run circles around him. You can provide him unimportant information while keeping the core secrets to heart. You can seek this opportunity to obtain potion formulas and even their beyonder ingredients. After some time, when there are corresponding changes, you can consider switching strategies. Of course, you can't be too careless. Duke Negan is an example of this mistake. Just as he said that, sitting at the bottom of the long model table, the World Gehrman Sparrow glanced at Miss Justice. He said with a hoarse smile, when the time comes, even if Vin Rambus were to die, no one will suspect you. Even if Vin Rambus were to die. He's a demigod. Mr. World has plans of attacking Vin Rambus? It's possible. He has always been investigating Quarren's suicide case. He was even the one who informed me of Vin Rambus's true identity. Audrey's eyes widened slightly as she felt perturbed. Even when she hated and felt the most fear towards Vin Rambus, she had never had thoughts of killing this psychology alchemist's counselor. All she considered was the means to avoid being guided. On the one hand, it was because she didn't have such thoughts, and on the other hand, it was because he was a demigod. This meant the top-ranking power in the kingdom and churches. I understand what needs to be done. Thank you, all of you. Audrey drew a breath and politely thanked them. Klein sure sounds bombastic these days. Yes, he even wishes to get rid of Amon's avatars in Backlund. Vin Rambus is really nothing. Leonard looked at the World Gehrman Sparrow with mixed feelings. Katlia and company also remained silent. With the topic of the psychology alchemists coming to an end, Klein controlled the World Gehrman Sparrow to make him look towards himself. Honorable Mr. Fool, I wish to communicate privately with Mr. Star. Klein temporarily didn't wish to let the other members of the Tarot Club learn about the eradication of Amon's avatars. It wouldn't be good for keeping the matter confidential, and it might lead them to be targeted by Amon. Sure. The fool Klein naturally didn't deny his own request. As Leonard was feeling poignant at the possibility of private communication, he informed Klein of the main points in Palaz Zorost's reply. It also included the problem of the Worm of Time beyonder characteristics loss. This made Klein suddenly realize how he could use his Worms of Spirit to create charms and bullets. Split off a few and kill them. When the characteristic contained in them return to my body, the remaining material can also be used like a Worm of Time. The only problem is that killing Worms of Spirit deals a certain level of damage to myself. After all, each Worm of Spirit contains a part of my spirit body. Yes, I have to limit the number each time. Only after I fully recover can I do it again. In thought, Klein got the World Gehrman Sparrow to reply, I will try my best to confirm if a blessing of concealment is possible before I give you an answer. If there's no problem, we can attempt to seek out sealed artifacts of the Marauder pathway at the demigod level. Of course, I will try to think of the means to identify the grafting of fate. Klein wasn't sure if observation from above the gray fog would allow him to see the truth of fate, just like how he was able to see his believers being parasitized. Hence, he planned on using the paper crane to contact Snake of Mercury Will Ossepton and gain his expert opinion. Alright. As Leonard grumbled about how Old Man would have recovered further if demigod-level sealed artifacts at the Marauder pathway were that easy to find, he nodded slightly in response. Chapter 991 A Ritual Without a Reply. After ending the private communication, Klein made the World Gehrman Sparrow look at Katlia. Please inform Queen Mystic that I wish to meet her to talk about something. The exact time and location is up to her. Queen Mystic? So Ma'am Hermit represents the royals above the 5 seas. Leonard was first taken aback before he came to a realization. What's the matter? Cadlia frowned slightly in a wary manner. I will forward her your intentions, but I cannot provide any guarantees over her agreement. Okay. The World Gehrman Sparrow nodded simply, indicating that it was fine. At this moment, Derek finally had an opportunity as he asked, everyone. He glanced at Mr. Hanged Man and Mr. World before continuing, the ritual needed for me to advance to Priest of Light requires pure darkness. I need to bury my entire body in ice that usually doesn't melt. In the City of Silver, such ice isn't difficult to find. However, how do we create pure but safe darkness? So that's the Priest of Light's advancement ritual. Little Sun sure is honest and simple. Due to her lack of experience and knowledge, Audrey was unable to provide any substantial suggestions. All she could do was cast her eyes at the person she believed was capable of resolving the problem, the World Mr. Gehrman Sparrow. And at this moment, the World raised his hands to pinch his temples. As for the fool Klein, he was rapidly trying to think of a solution. Sigh, if this were the outside world, pure darkness is extremely easy to obtain. Ice that normally doesn't melt would be the most troublesome thing to obtain, but the City of Silver is the complete opposite. There, darkness is too dangerous. Just being within it will result in one's disappearance or suffering the attacks of strange monsters. I can get Leonard to provide charms from the Evernight domain, and then I can stir some of the powers of the mysterious space above the gray fog. Using Little Sun's prayers, I can provide an area of artificial darkness. But the problem lies in me being unable to determine if this would bring the normal danger that the City of Silver encounters. This is not something that can be answered with divination. When matters do not involve myself, I can only determine if a matter is dangerous or not, or when matters should be done. And under such situations, there are too many elements involved, and the sources of danger are diverse. Yes, I'll summon a Rhodes later and ask it. Klein had previously been considering the problem over Little Sun's advancement, but he had never been able to find an answer. Seeing the world silent, Leonard, who had originally wanted to say that creating pure darkness is extremely easy, slowly shut his mouth. He began pondering over the sun's words and caught notice of a word that he had ignored, safe. In the forsaken land of the gods, in the City of Silver, darkness is equivalent to danger? Leonard roughly grasped the key idea, but due to his lack of understanding, he was unable to provide any suggestions. Finally, it was Alger who spoke. He glanced at Derek and said, I will help you gather information and seek out solutions. But in the process, you might need to provide some help to confirm that it can be done. No problem. Derek answered without any hesitation. Right on the heels of that, he added, there's no need to rush it. I still have about a month before I can finish digesting my notary potion. Alger nodded gently, indicating that this wasn't something that needed any reminders. At this moment, Cadlia deliberated for a moment and said to Derek, perhaps we can consider this problem from another angle. Your advancement ritual wouldn't last too long. We can simply increase the time you can survive in pure darkness to resolve this matter. I remember that you've mentioned that after being left in darkness with zero light, there are two dangers. The first would be the attacks from strange monsters that come from unknown origins, and the second would be a baffling instance of disappearance that is akin to evaporating. The former situation is easy to resolve. You can make a request to your chief for certain sealed artifacts, or you can get him to stand guard by your side. As for the second case, I don't know enough. You can attempt to ask your chief. Derek thought about it carefully and suddenly felt that this was a viable train of thought with a rather significant chance of success. He immediately replied in pleasant surprise, "Thank you, ma'am Hermit." The exchange and learning session continued until the gathering slowly came to an end. Seeing that it was almost done, the fool Klein rapped gently on the table's corner. "Let's end it here for today. Your wish is our will." Audrey and company stood up and bowed reverently. After they vanished from above the gray fog, Klein left the area and returned to the real world. He first took out his wallet and got the paper crane which was folded by Wuxia. Spreading it across the table, he picked up a pencil and simply wrote, "There's something." After folding the paper crane and stuffing it under his pillow, Klein got into bed and genuinely took an afternoon nap. In his hazy dream, he once again saw the pitch-black plains and the towering steeple. Passing through the plains and through the wooden doors, Klein arrived at the familiar corner. A black pram came out of the thick shadows as Wuxia, wrapped in silver silk, sucked at his right thumb and derided angrily, "You are getting more and more impolite." Klein laughed dryly and said, "With our relationship, there's no need for such pleasantries, right?" Wuxia harumphed and said, "Speak, what's the matter?" "This is the thing, I recently encountered Amon's avatar," Klein said directly. The baby's mouth widened a little as though he was about to cry. It took him great effort to control himself as he said, "I haven't been born for more than a month. There's nothing I need from you. I only wish to ask you a question," Klein quickly added. Wuxia raised his fleshy arm and waved it. "What is it?" Klein immediately said with a smile, "Amon's avatar can steal the destiny of others and appear while replacing their identities. I wish to know how I can see through such a terrifying matter." Wuxia chuckled as he pointed up at the sky with his index finger. "Pray for help. From the looks of it, using the powers of the gray fog can be used to discover the grafting of destiny." Klein heaved a sigh of relief as he felt even more certain. When he thought of the word "using," he was referring to using his marionette to pray to the fool while he entered above the gray fog. Through the point of light representing his believer, he could survey the surrounding area to seek out any abnormalities. In a sense, this was equivalent to the fool's observation, an equivalent to an augmented, true vision. But the problem is that I can't stay above the gray fog to observe for grafting all the time. It might be the case that, in between two of the observation periods, Amon could have entered Baklun Street and have done something. Klein thought before asking with some deliberation, "Anything you would like to remind me of?" Wuxia turned his head away without looking at him as he mumbled, "You have to visit me and my parents once this week." "During high tea, no problem." Klein agreed without any hesitation. Only then did the baby turn his head back and giggle. "Next week, around Wednesday or Thursday, there might be some changes in your destiny." "Is that so?" Klein nodded in thought as he watched the black pram slowly retreat into the shadows. After waking up from his dream, he packed up his items and began setting up an altar without any rest. This time, the target of his prayer was the Evernight goddess herself, and not artificial death. This was to prevent Amon from prying upon the source of the stirring via the changes in destiny and, thus, noticing something wrong. How could the Evernights blessed be praying to artificial death? After setting up the ritual, Klein wiped his face and turned into the cold-looking German sparrow, causing his height to drop a little lower. After igniting the first 2 candles in front, Klein made the ordinary candle representing himself burn with a yellow flame. There were 2 candles in front. One was a candle made of night vanilla and slumber flower to represent Evernight, and the other was a candle made up of white chestnut flowers and wild rose to represent concealment. Following that, he created a wall of spirituality, dripped full moon essential oil, and burned some herbal powder that pleased the goddess. Bit by bit, he completed the ritual. Towards the end, Klein took 2 steps back, activated his spirit vision, and chanted softly, "I pray for the power of the dark night. I pray for the power of the mystery. I pray for the goddess's loving grace. I encountered blasphemer Amon's avatar in Baklund. He was gathering the characteristics of a marauder pathway demigod. I seek for the blessings of concealment so as to complete the mission of eradicating the blasphemer's avatars. Night vanilla, a herb that belongs to the red moon, please pass my supplication to the goddess. Moonflower, a herb that belongs to the red moon, please pass my supplication to the goddess." After he was done chanting, Klein patiently waited for a while, but nothing happened. There wasn't any reply. This. The goddess is in a critical period of gaining control over the death pathway's uniqueness and is unable to respond beyond anything normal. Should I try to pray to artificial death? After all, if there are the blessings of concealment, Amon wouldn't be able to see it. If it doesn't, then the source of stirring destiny wouldn't point to me. Klein frowned little by little as he ended the ritual and cleared the altar. He felt that he needed to find other solutions. After he finished clearing the desk and turned around, prepared to head for the reclining chair, a figure suddenly appeared in front of him. The figure wore a simple linen robe with signs of patching. By the figure's waist was a belt made of tree bark. Raven black hair cascaded down freely as the figure's feet didn't wear any socks or shoes, making them covered in dust and wounds. It was a lady. She had extremely normal facial features. Her ghostly black eyes were no different from the common person, but just looking at her left Klein feeling a sense of extreme peace and serenity. Even though feelings of alarm rose up within him, they were unable to overpower the peacefulness. Chapter 992 Arodza's congratulations, you are? Klein asked in a rather complicated state of calmness. The lady in a simple robe nodded and said, Ariana, servant of concealment. Servant of concealment. Ariana. Klein's eyes constricted, as he knew who the lady was. As a former Nighthawk, how could he not be aware of the name Ariana? She was the Evernight Cloister's matron, head of the 13 archbishops, a likely candidate for the future pope. Regardless of which identity she had, she was part of the general knowledge that couldn't be avoided in religious studies and mysticism. As for the name, Servant of Concealment, Klein had read about it in Emperor Rozel's diary. Considering the similar name of Attendant of Mysteries, he suspected that this pointed to an angel. Meanwhile, based on the law of Beyonder characteristics conservation, with a sequence O in existence, it meant that Attendant of Mysteries couldn't be a sequence 1 angel. Therefore, Klein believed that the Servant of Concealment was likely sequence 2 of the Evernight pathway. This. It isn't that the goddess didn't reply, but that she used a very special way to respond. She directly sent her servant over. Klein felt mixed emotions that could hardly be described. He fell silent for a few seconds before giving a solemn bow. Good afternoon, Your Eminence. In the various churches, if a demigod at the angel level walked the land, there was a need to address them as Your Eminence as a show of respect. Likewise, towards the pontiff, pope, and chief shepherd representatives of the deities one had to use Your Holiness. In addition, a church's head was synonymous with the Holy See or Apostolic See. Of course, many a time, the Holy See could also represent the church's headquarters itself. Ariana tapped her chest 4 times in a clockwise fashion and replied in a pious manner, May the goddess bless you. She then said, I'm an ascetic. You can just call me ma'am. Yes, ma'am Ariana. Klein didn't insist. Ariana looked at him calmly for 2 seconds and directly asked, You plan to deal with blasphemer Amon's avatars in Backlund? Yes, I wish to obtain the blessings of concealment, Klein frankly replied. At this moment, he felt a little stumped because this was different from what he expected. He originally expected the goddess to answer by blessing him. Then, he and Pallas Zoroast could join forces to wipe out all of Amon's avatars in Backlund. During this process, it wouldn't expose Leonard or the Marauder Pathway Angel. But now, with the blessings becoming something corporeal that would be involved in the battle, Pallas Zoroast would immediately be discovered once he took action. When that happened, it was hard to predict what would ensue. Don't tell me I don't need to ally with Pallas Zoroast. I'll only get him to provide intel and then split some of the spoils of war. Klein's thoughts rapidly ran through his mind as Ariana spoke unhurriedly. I can provide the power of concealment to shield everything that happens from the prying of fate. However, I cannot guarantee that I can eliminate all of Amon's avatars in Backlund. Pallas Zoroast said that he has the means of doing so. The person who understands Amon the best is indeed a sequence one of the same pathway. Klein thought and said, Ma'am Ariana, I have already come up with a well-thought-out plan. All you need is to provide the power of concealment. You do not need to be involved in the actual battle. Leave the rest to me. Ariana nodded and raised her right arm as she spread her palm. Points of light lit up, profound and resplendent as they quickly outlined an emblem in her palm. This emblem was completely crystallized, as though it was made of obsidian. It made one realize its existence when looking at it, but it appeared to vanish when not looking at it. This is my Evernight coat of arms. It doesn't possess any characteristics or power by itself. The only use is that, when triggered, it will establish a connection with me, regardless of where you are in the real world, Ariana explained simply. Before you begin your operation, remember to use it. I will provide you with the power of concealment. If you need more direct assistance, use Ancient Hermes to chant Ariana when triggering it. This is equivalent to an itemized altar and ritual that points to her. Oh, at the level of angel, the range of responding to prayers has extended to the entire world? Klein instantly grasped the true nature of the Evernight coat of arms. As a bizarro sorcerer, he did not have the means to reply to prayers. This was a trait that could be obtained only at Sequence 3. Of course, as Sea God and the Fool, he was very well versed in such matters. Klein didn't stand on ceremony as he accepted it and bowed sincerely. Thank you. After saying that, he tapped 4 spots in a clockwise manner on his chest, forming the sign of the Crimson Moon. Praise the Lady. This way, he could still join forces with Palez Zoroast. As long as he triggered the Evernight coat of arms without using Ancient Hermes to chant Ariana's name, everything would be fine. Praise the Lady, Ariana replied piously. Her figure then vanished as though she had been erased by an eraser. This is a departure by entering a concealed state? Klein pursed his lips in thought. Meanwhile, he was filled with suspicion over Ariana's swift arrival. After all, the Evernight pathway wasn't well versed in methods such as teleport. To go from Winter County all the way to Backlund required a significant amount of time. My ritual isn't the kind that prays for a direct descent. Could it be that Ma'am Ariana happened to be in the vicinity, in the Backlund diocese? Isn't that too much a coincidence? If it isn't one, it only serves to exacerbate the problem. What is she doing in Backlund? The undercurrents are stirring. Klein retracted his gaze and patiently waited a while before turning back into Dwayne Dantes. He found a pen and some paper once again and drew the symbol that was a mixture of concealment and mystery prying. When the final stroke was written, the full-body mirror in the master bedroom produced a dark but pure light, as though a silent undercurrent was surging out from the bottom of a lake. Right on the heels of that, fireworks appeared, bursting in the sky. Colors of gold, silver, red, and blue exploded as words formed in the mirror. Welcome back, Great Master. Your humble servant, Orodes, has witnessed the retrieval of a portion of your authority. I'm thrilled that you are gradually recovering your aura. You will eventually return to your supreme position and make the entire world turn silent under your watch. This is really passionate. There's always something new. Klein nodded in silence. Amidst the fireworks, those words dissipated and formed into a new sentence. Great Master, what instructions do you have for me? I have a question, Klein said calmly. In a place where being in darkness can result in danger, how should one create a safe but pure darkness? There are 2 kinds of dangers involved. 1, it will make a person directly vanish in the darkness, and 2, it will cause strange monsters to appear and attack. The fireworks in the full-body mirror calmed down as aqueous light rippled. Silver words surfaced one after another. Great Master, are you referring to the forsaken land of the gods? This magic mirror actually knows quite a lot. He also gave me a free question in passing. Klein nodded and said, that's right. Without any breaks in between, Rhodes's full-body mirror produced new lines of Loanese text. The formation of the forsaken land of the gods is related to the second creator's fall. The danger of night there stems from the transformation of two essential powers. First, it's the remnants of the Evernight goddess's divine powers. Second, it's the influence left behind by the creator. He wielded partial authority over shadows, darkness, fallen, corruption, and mutation. The former makes creatures vanish into thin air, while the latter produced monsters in the darkness. So the two types of dangers stem from different powers. It's no wonder that there's such huge differences. Rhodes called the ancient sun god the second creator. This is very close to my theory. Amon's and Adam's father isn't the reawakening of the original creator, but a transmigrator who inherited a huge inheritance? Klein asked in thought. In that case, the Evernight goddess was involved in the fall of the second creator? This was something Klein had vaguely expected. This was from the trait of humans evaporating in the darkness of the forsaken land of the gods. It was very similar to the strange disappearances if one didn't sleep at night in the ruins of the Battle of the Gods. And based on Little Sun's description, king of demonic wolves, Phlegria, who wielded control over the Evernight and concealment authorities, had long perished in the second epoch. It was impossible that he had done it. Therefore, unless there was another deity of the Evernight pathway born in the middle, it was difficult for the two abnormalities to not have the Evernight goddess involved. On the surface of the mirror, the silver light rapidly converged, forming a short sentence. That's right. That's right. Klein was just about to press on when he immediately shut up. He had just recalled one of his identities, blessed of the Evernight. Therefore, even without anyone watching him, he had to show respect to the deity and not seek out relevant secrets. Of course, time in the mysterious space above the gray fog was excluded. He was just about to focus on the main question from before to urge Rhodes to list out solutions when he saw the silver words in the full-body mirror change. Great Master, your loyal servant, Rhodes, wishes a small favor from you. See, can we not discuss matters regarding the Evernight goddess? At the end of the question, a simple stick figure was drawn. Just as I wished. Klein deliberately pondered for 2 seconds and said, "Okay." The silver swirls on the surface of the mirror immediately turned brisk as words began taking form. As for the question you asked, there are 2 solutions. One is to accept the corruption and let oneself transform into monsters of the darkness. The reason why these creatures do not vanish into thin air during the night is because they have received the protection of the fallen authority. This way, all the darkness is equivalent to safety. The second is to create a darkness that comes with the dream world. This will allow the spirit body to receive the protection of the dream, thus, slowing down the encroachment of danger at night. Chapter 993. Another possibility allowing the spirit body to receive protection of a dream to slow down the encroachment of danger at night. This is similar to the necessity to sleep when night fell in the ruins of the battlefield of the gods. Also, the powers in the forsaken land of the gods likely isn't under the goddess's control. Once one vanishes in the darkness over there, they definitely won't enter the foggy town. Where will it point towards? Or would they stay in the same spot, unable to interact with companions and the real world until they die of starvation or old age? After reading Rhodes's reply, Klein was somewhat enlightened as he roughly grasped the crux of the issue. However, he felt that this wasn't necessarily useful, because the sun only required pure darkness so that he could be buried in ice that normally wouldn't melt to consume the priest of light potion. Once he entered a dream, there was no way for him to control his own body to complete that critical step. That way, even if he could remain in the darkness for prolonged periods of time, it would be meaningless. Yes, I'll wait until Little Sun asks the chief of the City of Silver before coming up with an actual plan based on his answer. Of course, before that, I can try to get a corresponding solution from Leonard to figure out how to create darkness with a temporary dream world. Klein nodded slightly, acknowledging the answer provided by the magic mirror. As for the first option of accepting corruption and turning into a monster in the darkness, it wasn't even considered. In the extraordinary world, this was equivalent to committing suicide, which almost couldn't be reversed. Upon considering how he still had one question left to ask, Klein deliberated and asked, "Where can I obtain the potion formula of the Seer Pathways Sequence 3, Scholar of Your?" The full-body mirror's surface had aqueous light ripple once again as it reflected a dark cathedral without any natural light. Klein found this scene very familiar as he immediately recalled what it represented. This was where Zeradol, who had turned into a monster, hid. However, this time, deep inside the cathedral, the cluster of blurry and huge maggots were no longer present. Just as Klein's pupils dilated, the silver words appeared beneath the scene depiction: "Great Master, Zeradol has vanished. I can't find him." Vanished. Klein momentarily forgot to breathe. Although he had long known of Zeradol's return, since he was the one who began the chain reaction by opening the door to the foggy town, he never expected this big shot to secretly leave the cathedral, his whereabouts becoming unknown. Even a Rhodes is unable to locate him. What is he plotting? The more Klein thought, the more a chill ran down his back. Having become a Sequence 4 demigod, he could confirm one thing: his control over the mysterious world above the grey fog was still insufficient. He could temporarily only converge the leaking specialness that it had augmented him within the real world, making it difficult for Beyonders of corresponding pathways to see it, but it was unable to repress the law of Beyonder characteristic convergence. As for the grey fog, it had proven time and time again that he had an invisible form of attraction towards Beyonders of the Seer, Apprentice, and Marauder pathway. Amongst them, the effects on the Seer pathway was most evident. Besides, I myself am quite an attractive Sequence 4 Bizarro sorcerer. It's not impossible for Zeradol to suddenly come to Backlund one day. Klein maintained a deadpan expression and said to the full-body mirror that was switching scenes, "Got it." Antigonus presented another scene which Klein was equally familiar with. It was the Antigonus family's treasure trove at the peak of the Hornacis mountain range. Below this scene, silver words quickly surfaced once again: "Great Master, there's another possibility, but I can't tell. I just know that it's easier than the first two." The Antigonus family's notebook isn't there this time? That's right. It will lead the wielder to the main peak of the Hornacis mountain range to seek out the Antigonus family's treasure trove. It's basically the same as the previous option. What's the possibility that even a Rhodes can't tell? Based on what I know about the factions in control of the Seer pathway, it's implying that I should pray to the goddess for it. The goddess is the mother of concealment, so she can choose whether a Rhodes can see it or not. Klein's thoughts scattered and quickly made a connection. Of course, he didn't believe that directly praying for the Scholar of Your potion formula would allow him to get it. It was too ridiculous, as though it was child's play. From his experience as a Nighthawk, he suspected that he might need to make enough contributions before he could obtain the Scholar of Your potion formula from the Evernight goddess via a ritual. Making enough contributions. This sure is a familiar phrase. Klein sighed as he began having some ideas. Clearly, he had hints on how to do so handle the artificial death faction of the Numinous Episcopate. However, Klein suspected that the goddess only had up to the Scholar of Your sequence for the Seer pathway potion formulas, and not the subsequent ones at the angel level. This was because the Antigonus family's angel didn't perish immediately back then but had hidden in a secret palace, losing control to become a monster and was in a half-sealed state. In addition, the Fool card was also there and hadn't been retrieved yet. At this moment, Klein had the intention of asking about Amon's avatars, but he suddenly recalled that within the memories of the rat demigod, the warning about the Marauder pathway angel and Amon had been given by this very mirror. As his thoughts flashed through his mind, Klein narrowed his eyes, looked at the full-body mirror, and nodded. "All right, that's it for today. Head back. If there's anything in the future, I'll summon you again." "Yes, Master." "Goodbye, Master, your loyal and humble servant, or Rhodes, is constantly waiting to return to your side. Light gathered on the mirror's surface, depicting a stick figure waving its hand. After everything returned to normal, Klein turned around and picked up the paper with the previously drawn symbol. With a snap of his fingers, he made it burst into scarlet flames. The ash floated down as he spread open his left hand. In it were 2 maggots shimmering with solid mysterious symbols. The 2 maggots squirmed gently, using their life force to fill the entire bedroom with madness and bizarreness. The surrounding lights then dimmed and brightened from time to time in a non-uniform fashion. They were none other than the worms of spirit which Klein had separated from himself. Suddenly, Klein reached out his right palm, suddenly pressing them towards the 2 transparent maggots. Instantly, his palm paused, just short of touching the worms of spirit. He raised his palm again, lowering it only to pause. He repeated this several times until he finally exerted his strength with a deadpan expression. Amidst an invisible and illusory cracking sound, his head suddenly felt a stabbing pain. This made his soul feel like it was being ripped apart. It was even more painful than encountering a gunshot or a slash wound. Klein used his clown powers to control the twitching of his facial muscles. After a few seconds, he raised his right hand to rub his temples, inwardly mumbling, "Indeed, the death of every worm of spirit deals damage to the spirit body. My current limit is 6. I'll temporarily stop trying. Let's see how long it takes to recover." Thankfully, this is a tolerable matter. Otherwise, it would be dangerous if a marionette is destroyed while the worm of spirit isn't able to be collected in time due to an intense battle. Yes, it's different from Amon's worms of time avatars. A Bizarro sorcerer's worms of spirit will not necessarily die when a marionette is destroyed. Most of the time, a Bizarro sorcerer is able to retrieve them in time. It's because the distance between the body and the marionette isn't that exaggerated. After confirming the situation, and waiting for the Beyonder characteristics contained within the worms of spirit to return to himself, Klein rummaged for some materials and set up a ritual to pray to the fool. After a series of tasks, Klein used the carcasses of 2 worms of spirit, 2 silver plates, and the complicated symbol which he had previously recorded down to make 2 silver-black bullets, of which the latter came from Snake of Mercury Will-Septon. The 2 bullets were carved with strange, indescribable patterns. They kept extending inwards as though they were coming together in the middle at one point. Their entire bodies were gloomy but not dark. Just one look at it made one's thoughts sluggish. Klein flicked a gold coin and used divination, together with his spiritual intuition, to swiftly determine the abilities of the 2 bullets. The target would immediately enter a state of paralysis upon being hit. The length of time that one was left in this state depended on the potency of one's spirit body. Even Sequence 3 saints would be in a state of stiffness for a second or 2. This already exceeds my powers. Of course, the premise is that contact can be made. Oh, this is a result of the gray fog's augmentation. These 2 bullets should be at the same level as the Fate Siphon charms. Although my worms of spirit can't be compared to Amon's and Palez's worms of time, the amount of power I can now draw from the mysterious space above the gray fog is clearly superior to what I could do in the past. I shall call them, control spirit bullets. Klein drew Death Knell from his underarm holster, snapped open the cylinder wheel, and stuffed the 2 silver-black control spirit bullets inside. Following that, he spread open a piece of paper beside the altar and wrote, "Next, your mission is to seek out relatively high-level charms and Beyonder bullets. May God be with you. XXX who raised 3 requests from you." This letter was written to Patrick Bryan of the Numinous Episcopate's Artificial Death faction. With a subordinate at my disposal, why let him go to waste? As Klein mumbled, he folded his letter. At the altar from before, he summoned Patrick Bryan's messenger. The surface of the desk burst into pitch-black flames and quickly gathered together, forming a translucent bird with dark feathers. This spirit world creature glanced at Klein before slowly lowering its head to bite at the envelope. Watching it disappear, Klein nodded slightly and inwardly muttered, Patrick's contract companion isn't of a low level either. He quickly reined in his thoughts, took out another letter, and fluidly wrote, I have already obtained the blessing of concealment. You can attempt to gather items at the Marauder Pathway demigod level. In addition, I've found a way to crack the theft and replacement of destiny. You don't have to be too anxious. Do you know how to create a darkness that includes a temporary dream world? If you have the time, can you head to Tingen and help me use 3-0782 to create flaring sun bullets? The mutated sun sacred emblem has the divine blood of the eternal blazing sun hidden in it. Only by sufficiently raising your strength can we be more confident at dealing with Amon's avatars. Chapter 994 Prelude at 7 Pinster Street. Leonard, who had specially returned home to participate in the tarot gathering, was just about to head to St. Samuel Cathedral's basement to read the dossiers so as to make preparations for his placating of souls at night when his vision suddenly went into a blur. He saw the messenger in a dark, full dress holding 4 blonde, red-eyed heads. As a soul assurer, he could already see such creatures with spirit bodies. After taking Klein's letter, Leonard didn't even have the chance to say thank you when Rionette Tynker turned around and walked into the void. She didn't even stay for long. Old man, why does Klein have a messenger of this level? Is this a perk of being a blessed? Leonard couldn't help but ask Pallas Zoroast with a suppressed voice. He originally fantasized that it was standard for every tarot club member, but he later realized that he had been imagining things. Pallas Zoroast's slightly aged voice chuckled immediately. It is likely to solely belong to Klein Moretti. Everyone receives some special fortuitous encounter, isn't that the case? Isn't it the same even for a fellow like you? Heh, I thought you would use incomplete angel to describe her, but you ended up using messenger of this level. Not bad, you still remember my warning. Leonard curled the corners of his lips, spread open the piece of paper, and read the content on it. He's indeed the blessed of concealment and fate. Pallas Zoroast quickly scanned the heading through Leonard's eyes. Leonard didn't look at the ground. Instead, he took a few steps back and threw himself into the embrace of the sofa before saying, Klein can see through the theft and replacement of destiny. Then, we don't need to rush to seek out items at the Marauder Pathway demigod level. Even if you were in a hurry, you have no idea where to seek them out, Pallas scoffed. Even for the gathering of the Hermits of Fate, similar items needed years to appear even once. And the next gathering was to happen at the end of the year. Leonard was momentarily at a loss for words and could only cast his gaze at the last 2 paragraphs. After a brief silence, he chuckled. I've always been curious as to where Klein received the high-level charm of the Sun domain when facing Megos. I thought it was provided to him by that death console, but I couldn't understand why a death domain angel would be gathering high-level charms of the Sun domain. Wouldn't that be suicide? Now, I finally understand. Old man, I wielded 3-0782 before as well. Why didn't you notice that there was a drop of the eternal blazing sun's divine blood hidden in that? If you could have stolen some of its power back then, things wouldn't have. Leonard originally wanted to mock old man, but as he went on, he fell silent. Pallas Zoroast sighed in his mind. If that drop of divine blood could be so easily discovered, that mutated sun sacred emblem wouldn't have been in Tingen. Leonard fell silent for a few seconds before asking, then how am I to create an opportunity to get that sacred emblem to create the flaring sun charm? Although Klein made it sound simple in his letter, Leonard knew that it wasn't an easy task. This was because he wasn't a Nighthawk of Tingen City. Even if he returned to visit his former colleagues and teammates, he had no authority to enter Cheney's Gate. Upon hearing his question, Pallas Zoroast replied in a peeved manner, "Why are you asking me something as trivial as this? Can't you think for yourself?" Leonard coughed uncomfortably as he began thinking seriously to seek out a solution. "I'm currently working alone, but the Archbishop has given me the authority to get the help of the local Nighthawks in the region of question." If all the souls in Backland have been placated, and if I haven't finished digesting my potion, wouldn't I have to do it at other dioceses? When that happens, if Tinjin happens to have a paranormal accident, it will be very reasonable for me to return and get 2 Nighthawks and use 3-0782, after Leonard finished muttering to himself. Palaz Zoros chuckled. Not bad. You came up with an idea so quickly. But have you thought about it? You are placating them, not purifying them. This is contradictory with obtaining 3-0782. It will easily incur suspicion. Leonard, who had been praised, immediately laughed. Old man, that's because you aren't aware. Back when I joined the Nighthawks team, there was one line in the education I received: only under the premise of having the ability to purify can placating achieve the best results. Emperor Roselle had also once said that to solve problems, you need a stick in one hand and a carrot in the other. Palaz Zorost immediately sked. Then follow your plan. Of course, that's assuming that you can finish Anthony Stevenson's missions in a week or 2. If you haven't obtained the sun flare bullets before the actual operation of eliminating Amon begins, then it would no longer be necessary. Leonard recalled the list of missions written on the pieces of paper as his forehead twitched. He then forced himself to forget about his worries and mumbled, I wonder when the mission to punish the Sanguine will begin. I wonder if the Sanguine has a sealed artifact at the Marauder Pathways demigod level. Temporary dream world. I can create it myself. I'll find a chance to make some charms, but can power at this level be able to resist the corrosion of the darkness in the forsaken land of the gods? In an apartment in Sherwood Borough. Furs took out a novel, sat on the sofa, and watched Zio walk towards the lobby as she wore her boots to head out. Finally, Furs couldn't hold back her puzzlement as she said, "There's no rush. That gentleman said that he wouldn't assign the mission that quickly." Zio shot her a glance and said, "I'm a bounty hunter. I have other missions." Upon saying that, she paused and said after some deliberation, "Furs, do you think that Miss Justice resembles Miss Audrey?" Furs was taken aback for a few seconds before she snapped back to senses. She subconsciously waved her hand and chuckled. How is that possible? Just as she said that, the similarities began flashing through her mind, her eyes widening in response. After a while, she whispered, "It's not impossible. Spectator pathway, psychology alchemists, noble lady, blonde hair and green eyes. She's the only noble I know that meets those criteria. Of course, I don't know that many nobles. Furthermore, I have no idea if the ones I'm familiar with have anything to do with the psychology alchemists." Zio silently listened to her friend and said after some thought, "Furs, do you still remember the missions assigned to us by Miss Audrey? I originally thought that it was issued by Earl Hall, but on second thought, perhaps it came from the tarot gathering. Also, how did we know of Mr. Fool's honorific name? Do you remember? It was from books we borrowed from Viscount Glaint. In the book cover was a strange ancient slip." Furs nodded in enlightenment. "If we could discover it, as a good friend of Viscount Glaint, Miss Audrey has a chance of discovering it as well. This can explain why she joined the gathering." "Yeah," Zio agreed with Furs's guess. Furs opened her mouth and was just about to say something when she recalled that the matter with the Sanguine wasn't completely over. She immediately looked around warily and said, "Zio, we should lessen our discussions of gatherings in the future. As for Miss Audrey, we can visit her once every week or 2. We can continue observing when the time comes." Zio snapped to her senses and nodded heavily. "All right." She then opened her door and went to a particular bar in East Borough and sat by the bar counter. Rapping on the table, she said to the bartender who looked up, "Any new missions today?" The bartender gave a rough list without mentioning any investigations of a particular Mr. Ernst Boyar. "Indeed, I'll have to wait till tomorrow or the day after tomorrow." Zio looked around, retracted her gaze, and asked in puzzlement and concern, "I haven't seen Sherman in a while. Do you know where he's been?" Sherman was a young man who thought himself as a woman one of Zio's informants. The bartender chuckled. Perhaps he ran off with some man. You do know that he's happy to do so if a man fancies him. This isn't something worth ostracizing him about, Zio rebutted seriously, feeling a baffling sense of concern. She then exerted strength in her palm and jumped off the high stool, prepared to seek out Sherman in the places he was usually seen. Backland Bridge area, Iron Gate Street, Braveheart's Bar. Holding down his hat, Emlyn pinched his nose as he passed through the crowd that exuded all kinds of smells before finding the red-eyed Ian in the card room. "Mr. White, what is it this time?" Ian smiled as he led Emlyn into an empty billiard room. Emlyn took off his hat and quipped, "Something trivial. Help me put up a mission to the bounty hunters. The details of the mission is to track a man named Ernst Boyar. Figure out his daily activities. The bounty reward will be £100. £100? Ian subconsciously asked. For investigations like tracking, £100 was quite a ridiculous reward. One had to know that if a bounty hunter was able to complete this mission on their own, they could rest for an entire year, even if they were supporting a family. Emlyn nodded. The target is rather dangerous. After the discussion back with the Tarot Club, he had already thought it through. He believed that tracking Ernst Boyar was an easy mission. The Sanguine Viscount would definitely pretend as though he didn't notice anything and deliberately follow a fixed trajectory. Therefore, this £100 was in fact payment for misjudgment to take the risk of participating in this operation. Of course, to aid in the misdirection and concealment, it was almost certain that more than one bounty hunter would complete this mission, allowing them to earn different portions of the reward. All Emlyn could guarantee was that misjudgment would earn the most. I see. Coming to an understanding, Ian extended his hand. Down payment, exact address, level of danger, looks and characteristics. It's best if you have a portrait. Ernst Boyar then gave £30 in cash and Ernst Boyar's portrait. Red eyes? Ian flipped through the pieces of paper in his hand and couldn't help but blurt out. Yes. Emlyn nodded gently and looked around him. He suppressed his voice and said, "There's also something else. Help me seek out clues regarding the Rose School of Thought members in Backland." Rose School of Thought? Ian was taken aback as he asked in puzzlement, as though he had never heard of the name. Chapter 995, Conjoined Person. Emlyn glanced at Lon, raised his hand to pinch his nose, and chuckled. "It appears you don't understand me. It's okay. A more simple description is to gather information about foreigners that come from the southern continent, especially from the Star Highlands and the Paws River Valley. What information do you want exactly? There are plenty of pure-blooded people from the southern continent in Backland. Those that you've mentioned are also common," Ian calmly asked without flaring up due to the contempt he received. Emlyn laughed. "The ones that are a bit more abnormal. They do things in a fishy manner and seem to all be mysterious. You should understand what I'm getting at. There are definitely many people you describe. In Backland, they are either servants, workers, or thieves being part of gangs. As the latter will all meet your criteria of being abnormal, fishy, and mysterious." Ian sincerely pointed out how unpragmatic Emlyn's request was. Emlyn was already prepared for this. With an unobvious smile, he nodded slightly. "Then, give me all the information that meets those criteria. I'll do the filtering. Oh, I'll pay £50 as down payment for this commission as the standard fees for the early-stage investigations. The subsequent payment will be counted based on how much information of value is provided. Each one will cost £20. Who is the one to determine its worth?" Ian asked after a few seconds of thought. For him, having a £50 income for preliminary work like this was enough for him to accept the job. It was more than enough to hire a dozen people or so to investigate the areas from East Borough to Sherwood Borough for half a month. He didn't mind how much he could only from the 50 pounds, as there were many people here who relied on him for their survival. He needed to arrange jobs with payment for them to do from time to time, otherwise, he would never be able to be kept abreast with the latest developments. Emlyn sized up Ian and scoffed. Of course it will be me. You should know how trustworthy I am. Detective Moriarty never told me that, Ian mumbled and sighed. All right. Our last cooperation was still pretty good. I choose to trust you. Emlyn nodded in satisfaction, took out his wallet, and counted another 50 pounds worth of notes. During this process, Emlyn momentarily felt the pinch when he realized he only had 407 pounds in savings. And now there's only 357 pounds. He looked away from the notes and handed the cash to Ian. He didn't stay. Putting on his hat, he walked out of the billiard room and left the Bravehearts bar. On the street, Emlyn stopped pinching his nose and looked up at the flame-like clouds. His expression gradually fell heavy as he silently muttered, "That wraith from before isn't around. Where did it go?" Humph, Ian acted as though he had never heard of the Rose School of Thought, but his racing heartbeat had betrayed him. Also, he actually didn't ask if Sherlock Moriarty is back in Backlund. He didn't even show any concern. Could it be that Sherlock has already returned to Backlund and that he has already met him? Rorstad Archipelago, City of Generosity, Byam. In an area near the harbor, Admiral of Stars Catlia had brought along Frank Lee, who had his sleeves rolled up which revealed his brown hair, to an area outside a house with gas wall lamps. They came to an empty corner and watched as a figure appeared out of the shadows. It was bloodless Heath Doyle who was in charge of monitoring Artisan Sealf. He was thin and his skin was so pale that it was transparent. He looked so frail that a gust of wind could topple him. Did anything strange happen recently? Catlia nudged the gold-rimmed glasses on her nose. Heath Doyle tersely acknowledged. 3 days after you left, a stranger visited Sealf. He stayed for about 15 minutes. I didn't approach for fear of being discovered. Based on your instructions, I sent men to tail the stranger, but they lost his trail. What did that stranger look like? Catlia asked with a slight nod. Heath Doyle took out a piece of raw beef from a leather pouch by his waist. The blood on it remained fresh, but it didn't show any signs of contamination. It appeared to be a pure piece of solid meat. Right on the heels of that, this piece of beef melted in Heath Doyle's hand, dripping to the ground like water. They then squirmed like they had life, drawing a portrait. This is the effect I want. Frank Lee's eyes shimmered as he watched this scene, expressing his intentions with excitement. Under his gaze, Heath Doyle had the intention to run, but he slightly slanted his body and pointed to the ground. Roughly like this. At this moment, a blood portrait had already taken form. It was that of a man with a mustache, with facial features that resembled that of the Paws River Valley. His greatest characteristic was the 3 ear studs on both his ears. Golden ear studs, thin body, not much fat, very athletic, Heath Doyle added. Catlia retracted her gaze from the ground and asked, and then? Heath Doyle tersely acknowledged. No one visited Sealf after that, other than his temporary servants and chef he hired. I got men to investigate them. They are clean. Sealf has an evening stroll at a fixed time every day. He will bring a prostitute home, allowing her to leave only at daybreak. I've been constantly tailing him, but I never discovered any contact with odd people. He has been acting very normally all this time? Catlia asked with a frown. From her point of view, not having any abnormalities made it most abnormal. After all, this involved Rose School of Thought members that believed in the primordial moon. Heath Doyle nodded in affirmation. Yes. Catlia turned her head to look at the building's main door and said after some thought, I actually planned on using Beyonder powers to infiltrate and bring Sealf under control in the fastest speed possible before taking him away to prevent any accidents. But from the looks of it, the best solution is to knock on the door. Unknown danger was what terrified people the most. At the thought that he had been busy with his experiments recently and hadn't done his duty as first mate, Frank Lee hurriedly said, "Captain, I'll go with you." Cadlia took off her thick glasses and hung them by her waist of her black warlock robe before nodding. "Okay." With that said, she left the shadowy corner and walked towards the main door of Sylph's residence. As she approached, she looked up at the crimson moon that could be seen penetrating through the clouds. She curled her fingers and tapped thrice on the door. Before long, footsteps approached and the door creaked open. Sylph didn't show any obvious changes from the previous time. He remained thin and dark. His eyes were somewhat puffy, and his brown eyes were trying hard to force a smile. "Admiral, is there something this time?" He stood by the door, blocking the gas wall lamp's light behind him. It made the area appear dark and gloomy, as though he was sinking into the shadows. Cadlia stared at him for a few seconds before saying slowly, "I have a new idea. I plan on making you a part of my crew." She stood there motionlessly without any intention of stepping inside. Sylph's expression warped as his voice turned somewhat dark. "Why?" Cadlia's eyes seemed to freeze as she slowly said, "Because I'm a pirate." Pirates didn't need reasons. They did whatever they did out of their own desires. Sylph's facial muscles twitched as a smile suffused his eyes once again. "I can be your sailor, but as an artisan, I'll be of much greater use in a city." "I agree," Cadlia destroyed his resistance. "But before then, I need you to spend some time on the future to be partners with others." Sylph's expression gradually turned cold as he replied in an ethereal voice, "I'm afraid I won't be able to control myself. I have a strong urge to procreate every day." "Strong urge to procreate?" Frank Lee's eyes lit up as he asked, seemingly in confirmation. Sylph was taken aback as he wasn't sure whether to nod or shake his head. Frank then looked at Cadlia and asked in excitement, "Captain, is he going to be my assistant for my experiments?" "I love this trait of his." Cadlia fell silent for a few seconds before nodding heavily. "Yes." Frank immediately revealed a bright smile and offered his right hand to artisan Sylph. "Pleasure to meet you. Let me introduce myself. First mate of the future, Frank Lee." Sylph's expression returned to normal as he shook the man's hand with puzzlement. Then, he said, "Am I really going to spend a short period of time on the future?" "I guarantee it with my reputation on the line," Cadlia sincerely replied before inwardly adding, "It wouldn't take long before Her Majesty personally handles you." "All right. It's not like I can beat you." Sylph shrugged. "Please permit me to pack my personal belongings." He then took 2 steps back, turned around, and walked to the staircase at the end of the foyer. As he walked, he suddenly paused and said in an ethereal tone to Cadlia and Frank Lee, "Today's moonlight is as beautiful as it always has been, isn't it?" Without receiving a reply, he proceeded forward and vanished from the staircase. At this moment, Cadlia's heavy expression became obvious. After Sylph opened the door, she had already noticed an abnormality with her eyes. In the past, Sylph's spirit body was that of an ordinary human, but now, he was a conjoined person. Under the illumination of the moonlight, this conjoined person was being nourished and was rapidly growing stronger. "This isn't a problem I can resolve. I have to write to Her Majesty. Also, I mustn't forget Gairman Sparrow's request for a meeting." Cadlia sighed silently as she subconsciously looked up. High in the sky, a crimson moon remained bright and silent amidst the thin clouds. Backlund, Hilston Backlund, East Balam Military Veterans Mess. Dwayne Dantes and Mocht got off their separate carriages and entered the lobby together. Chapter 996 Card Game. After entering the East Balam Military Veterans Mess, Klein handed his cane and hat to his valet, Enuni, only to see Colonel Calvin of the Lone Kingdom's Ministry of Defense wearing an army uniform, waiting at the foyer with a glass of red wine in hand. This long-faced officer smiled as he raised his cup at Dwayne Dantes. "Long time no see. It really has been a while." Klein smiled as he walked over. Colonel Calvin immediately offered his right hand. "Congratulations. You did pretty well." Everyone was very pleased. I was very pleased as well. Klein used a Lone-styled euphemism to express his pleasure in cooperating. He then shook hands with him. Calvin retracted his arm and glanced at Mocht before he said with a laughing sigh, "Back when you first introduced Dwayne, I was quite distrustful of your judgment, but now I understand how you're a member of Parliament." Anyone who interacts with Dwayne can easily tell that he's an expert at this. Mocht accepted the colonel's approbation with the same Lone-styled euphemism. Calvin retracted his gaze, sipped some red wine, and smiled at Dwayne Dantes, asking in passing, "How much did you earn this time?" "Don't worry, I won't raise prices in the future because of it. I'm simply curious." £20,000 in gold, Klein gave the midpoint value as an answer. In actual fact, he had earned £25,000, but after paying Miss Messenger £10,000 for her services, he had only earned £15,000. Calvin nodded. "Not bad. If you need to convert those gold bars into gold coins, I can introduce you to someone from an Imperial Mint factory." "How was it? Did you notice anything abnormal around Maysanchez's area?" Klein said directly without thinking, "Yes. There was a place called Revival Square under his control that was destroyed by lightning." "That, I'm aware of," Calvin replied with a rather heavy expression. "But you probably do not know that the person before you was the one who created the lightning." Klein smiled and then said, "Also, Maysanchez seems to be maintaining a fragile balance among many factions, but in actual fact, he has already secretly aligned himself with a particular faction. Of course, I'm not exactly sure who it is. He had no intention of betraying the Church of the God of Knowledge and Wisdom. All he did was divulge a little to win the trust of the lone military. The only thing that can be confirmed is that it isn't us." Calvin nodded and said with a deep look in his eyes, "It's unlikely to be Intis." Klein helped him eliminate one of the wrong choices. Calvin tersely acknowledged. "That isn't a bad thing either. The few factions surrounding Maysanchez are supported by Intis. If he wishes to expand, there's no way he can circumvent them. When the time comes, perhaps we will have more arms sales on our hands." With that said, he offered a toast. "Holy Lord of Storms, to riches for everyone." As believers of the Evernight goddess, Klein and Mocht smiled in response without giving a direct answer. After taking another sip of red wine, Calvin pointed at the second floor. "Dwayne, I brought you here today to play cards with a VIP. Texas Hold'em." "Which VIP?" Klein asked with piqued interest. Calvin's expression turned solemn as he said with an unobvious smile, "Admiral Emerius. He has been given a post and is currently in charge of the Ministry of Defense." Admiral Emerius. The admiral whose younger brother was stripped of his post as Governor-General, had his mistress corrupted by the Mother Tree of Desire, and ended up losing his post as highest commander of the Central Sonia Seas Navy? I've worked with him before and even pretended to be him for some time. Indeed, when it comes to a demigod, as long as they didn't screw up too badly, and if they are willing to hold it in, they will always be able to step out of the nadir. Klein recalled everything that had happened at Orovie Island, turning wistful. Towards Admiral Emerius Revolt, he still felt some guilt towards him. Although most of what happened back then didn't have anything to do with him, his mistress's anomaly was ultimately a result of the Mother Tree of Desire's wish to control him. That is to say that our future cooperation requires His Excellency's approval? Klein asked in enlightenment. That's how it is. Calvin nodded and pointed up the stairs. Let's head on up. When they arrived at the second floor, they stopped in front of a pair of dark red double doors. Calvin turned his head to glance at Dwayne Dantes. Your mission today is to lose money. Lose money? Klein sized up Calvin as he curled the ends of his mouth. I'll try my best. By the side, Mocked said with a laugh, there's actually no need to be too deliberate. Admiral Amirius has excellent card-playing skills. It's almost impossible if you wish to win any money. Heh, I always lose. Sigh, I just hope I won't lose too much today. Otherwise, I wouldn't even dare to return home. Klein nodded thoughtfully. I only brought £200 in cash. Would that be enough? Definitely not. Calvin chuckled. I've already changed chips worth £1,000 for you. Just remember to return it. Loan's best lawyers only earn about £1,000 a year on the surface. You bunch of profligates. Klein sized up Calvin again. This colonel didn't notice it as he knocked on the door. After a while, the double door creaked open, revealing the scene inside. It was a hall paved with thick, soft carpets. There wasn't a lot of furniture, making it appear rather spacious. In the middle of the hall was a card table that could accommodate more than 10 people. Surrounding it were luxurious-styled high-back chairs. By the sides of the hall were gold-plated cutlery, marble-carved sculptures, coffee tables with books and newspapers, and a series of leather sofas. Klein looked over and saw Amirius Revolt sitting at the seat of honor. This admiral didn't look different from before. His black hair was neatly combed backward, with his blue eyes dark and profound. The corners of his lips drooped slightly, and his face was clean-shaven. He had an austere temperament, and he wore dark blue clothes with an epaulet. He was meticulous in every detail, appearing extremely serious. When he swept his gaze, Klein found another, familiar person. He had thick but neat black brows with a short and hard crew cut of the same color. He had dark blue eyes and a high nosebridge with a bushy mustache spreading out from his mouth. He had a long face with accentuated outlines as well as callous curves. He was MI9's deputy director, Konas Kilgore. He was one of the targets for Klein's return to Backlund. He was the middleman in the dealings between the Demonist sect and a particular faction in the royal family. He was one of the accomplices of the Great Smog of Backlund. This brigadier general had abnormally broad shoulders, making his white shirt and black vest abnormally tight. He was playing Texas Hold'em with great focus. There are 3 demigods at a card table. How can this even be played? Interesting. Klein sat down and began observing the others at the table. During this process, an attendant delivered a huge stack of chips, worth a total of £1,000. In the first few rounds, Klein folded after looking at his cards. He acted very cautiously, acting as though he never called or raised unless he had good cards. As for Admiral Amirius, his style was the complete opposite of him. He was in no way conservative. He called almost every round, constantly raising in an extremely aggressive manner. Every round that he was involved in seldom reached the point where everyone showed their cards. Most people failed to withstand such aggression and, with the admiral's domineering force, they would call a round or two before folding. At times, someone would attempt to call Amirius Revolt's bluff, only to encounter 4 nines. The color in his face instantly drained as though he had been passed the death verdict by a judge. Konas Kilgore had a completely different style as well. He would occasionally lose a round, but the chips lost wouldn't be much, preventing him from having too great a loss. And in the next round after his loss, he would often be able to wipe out the person who won all his chips the previous round, forcing him to spend money to buy in again. Is there a need? Why are you using powers to cheat when dealing with low and mid-sequence beyonders or even ordinary people? Others might not be able to tell, but would I be fooled? One has the Arbiter Pathway's dominance, and the other has the Baron of Corruption's bribe. Klein looked at his 5 of hearts and 9 of clubs as he shook his head indiscernibly. He couldn't help but consider which powers of a seer pathway could provide him help if he wanted to cheat. Turn all my opponents into marionettes? In that case, I can win as much as I want. I'm practically invincible, but it's of no pragmatic value. It's not like I'm planning for some deathmatch poker tournament. Unfortunately, there aren't any mosquitoes here. Otherwise, I can use their spirit body threads and turn them into marionettes to help me check out their whole cards. Faceless only allows me to change myself, not the cards. Magician's illusion? The effects would likely be pretty good when playing with ordinary people or low and mid-sequence beyonders. But there are two demigods here. Use a clown's ability to swap cards? It's useless. The dealing and shuffling of cards are done by the croupier. As his thoughts raced, Klein realized that apparently only his powers as a seer was of use here. He threw out his two whole cards to indicate a fold before taking out a metal chip and allowing it to move between his fingers. At this moment, Amirius Revolt suddenly looked up at him and retracted his hands before pushing all his chips in. Indeed. Klein nodded inwardly without a hint of surprise. During his last cooperation, he knew that Admiral Amirius was able to distinguish ordinary people from beyonders from his position. He suspected that he could even determine a beyonders level, or in other words their position. However, Klein wasn't too worried, because a Bizarro sorcerer had concealment powers to a certain degree. This was also why he could converge the augmentation effect the gray fog had on him after he reached sequence 4. This made him confident that Amirius wouldn't be able to determine his level. However, he didn't attempt any corresponding interference, as he suspected that Amirius was able to tell that he was a beyonder. Therefore, he decided to reveal a tiny problem, making it easy to be seen through and be grasped. Chapter 997, Gambling God. Dwayne. The core rules of Texas Hold'em were very simple. It was to use 2 whole cards and 5 community cards to form a hand with any 5-card combination. Whoever had the biggest hand won. And the community cards were dealt in 3 phases. 3 community cards to form the flop in the first phase, a 4th community card called the turn in the second phase, and a 5th community card called the river in the third phase. Each phase allowed players to fold, check, call, or raise. This continued until everyone was done or until one person didn't fold. Klein fiddled with the chip in his hand as he divined the existence of any lucky instances within the next few rounds. However, he was unable to tell which exact round it was. After all, it was only a quick and simple divination with average effects. Using this method to play with ordinary people and low-sequence beyonders wouldn't be a problem as long as the correct strategy is used, but it's definitely inadequate against demigods. It's already quite a challenge to defeat a mid-sequence beyonder. Must I close my eyes each round and do a complete dream divination? Heh, if that were the case, Dwayne Dantes might end up with the title, Sleeping Gambling God. Klein sighed inwardly. He continued watching the round play out as he sat by the side. At present, he had already lost a big blind and a small blind e-sup when it was his turn. At this moment, Klein noticed one point: the MI9 deputy director, Konas Kilgore, had lost £20 to Admiral Amirius. A successful bribe. Admiral Amirius should be able to tell that Konas is using his powers as a baron of corruption, but he might not know that this MI9 deputy director is a demigod. The next round will be interesting. Hee. Klein jolted to attention as the new round began. He didn't check his whole cards when the croupier handed him 2 new ones. Instead, he placed the metal chip he was playing with in his hand onto his whole card, taking on the stance of not planning to look at them. After 2 people folded, the stern and old-fashioned Amirius Revolt casually took a look at his whole cards. After counting £5 worth of chips, he threw it into the middle of the table, having raised the stakes without garnering any surprises. Another person folded as mocked called. Right on the heels of that, Konas Kilgore, who had an unyielding personality, raised the stakes, throwing out a total of £20. Calvin confirmed his whole cards once again before calling. After one last person folded, Dwayne Dantes didn't do an actual count. He grabbed a handful of chips and threw it out. The croupier who was in charge of counting the chips glanced at it before precisely announcing Dwayne's action, £20. Call. I thought it would be £50. From the looks of it, I'm still not very used to these chips, the white-sideburn Dwayne Dantes with an outstanding temperament said with a laugh. However, he didn't add on the additional £30. At this moment, no one made a move. It was Emerius Revolt's turn again. This admiral didn't even glance at the remaining players. Picking up 5 10-pound chips, he threw them out. Another raise. He didn't show any perturbations in his emotions, acting as though he was ordering a cup of black tea. However, that indescribable sense of dominance and the act of repeatedly raising the stakes pre-flop made the mood at the table freeze. Such situations often implied that Admiral Emerius had excellent hole cards. Perhaps they were a pair of aces or a pair of kings, or an ace and king. Mock decided to fold. Konas Kilgore rubbed his high nose bridge and glanced around with his dark blue eyes before saying, "Call." Colonel Calvin confirmed his cards again. After 10 seconds of hesitation, he chose to fold. Dwayne Dantes touched the metal chip on his 2 hole cards and smiled. Call. After a round of expressing their intentions, there were only 3 players for the round. Then, the croupier flipped the 3 community cards in the middle of the table for the flop. 2 spade suit, 9 heart suit, K spade suit. The person who was up first was Admiral Emerius Revolt. He leaned forward slightly and said in a domineering manner, £50. He had immediately raised the stakes to £50. Mocked, Calvin and company, including those who weren't in the game, felt stifled for some baffling reason. Konas Kilgore trembled slightly, but he ultimately grabbed £50 and threw it out. Dwayne Dantes glanced at the deputy director of MI9. Completely unfazed by the pressure, he said with a smile, "Call." Upon hearing this, Calvin turned his head and nodded at Dwayne Dantes with his deep blue eyes that resembled a nighttime lake, indicating his approval. From his point of view, Admiral Emerius's domineering stance didn't affect a person who came to lose money. At this moment, the red-vested croupier revealed the 4th card, the turn, 9 spade suit. There were 3 spades, increasing the chances of a flush tremendously. However, Admiral Emerius still didn't hesitate. He calmly pushed a stack of chips, £100. Konas Kilgore's fingers tapped on his hole cards, showing his lack of confidence. But ultimately, he chose to call. Dwayne Dantes glanced at this deputy director once again and maintained his warm smile. Call. At this point in time, he had yet to see his hole cards, making Calvin somewhat worried. He believed that such an act was going overboard, a clear act of throwing money away. It wasn't something Admiral Emerius, who was relatively conservative, might find acceptable. At this moment, the red-vested croupier revealed the final card, the river, 2 club suit. As such, the community cards took form, 2 spade suit, 9 heart suit, K spade suit, 9 spade suit, 2 club suit. £200. Admiral Emerius pushed a pile of metal chips in with an extremely domineering attitude. Konas Kilgore took a deep breath before pushing 2 stacks of chips. £500. This amount of money was half of his purported annual salary. Is he trying to bluff? Calvin and Mock exchanged looks, believing that Brigadier General Kilgore had made it too obvious, making it easy to see through him. One had to know that when playing Texas Hold'em, apart from doing risk management and probability calculations, it also involved psychological battles most of the time. Be it in terms of body language, expression, or the style used for raises, they made it easy to expose one's hidden cards. Of course, good players could also use these details to deliberately misdirect their opponents. Dwayne Dantes sized up Konas Kilgore before he laughed. Then, like the previous few times, he said, "Call." Amirius raised his hands, prepared to push all his remaining chips, to pressure his opponents into folding. At this moment, he suddenly paused. His deadpan expression wore a look of solemnity. After a few seconds of silence, he calmly said, "Call." At this point, the whole cards could be revealed to compare each person's hand. Admiral Amirius flipped his card first. It was an A-spade suit and 10-spade suit. It formed a flush with the 2-spade suit, K-spade suit, and 9-spade suit. It was a rather high-ranking hand, with the only ones bigger than it being a full house, 4 of a kind, straight flush, and royal flush. "It's your turn," Amirius then urged Konas. Konas first flipped open a single card, K-diamond suit. It made 2 pairs with the K and 9 from the community cards. Following that, he picked up his second whole card. At that moment, the remaining poker cards at the red-vested croupier's end blurred. Pa! The whole card was flipped open, revealing itself, 9-club suit. "What?" Mocked and company exclaimed, hardly believing their eyes. This meant that Konas Kilgore had obtained a full house, 9s over kings. It was bigger than a flush. "Sorry about that." "Full house," Konas looked at Amirius and said with a smile. Then, he turned to look at Dwayne Dantes. "You can reveal your cards. I'm also very curious as to what my cards are." Dwayne Dantes smiled. He picked up the metal chip that he had placed down on his cards and very casually flipped the 2 whole cards. What?" Calvin and company rubbed their eyes. Dwayne Dantes's whole cards were a very weak pair, 2 heart suit, 2 diamond suit. There happened to be a very small pair in the community cards, 2 spade suit, 2 club suit. They formed a 4 of a kind, the smallest rank when it came to 4 of a kind, but it was higher ranked than all the full houses. Praise the lady. Dwayne Dantes drew the crimson moon across his chest in pleasant surprise, looking as though he had never expected it. An interesting round. Amirius was taken aback for a moment before he gently clapped. Konas Kilgore gave Dwayne Dantes a deep look and said with a laughing sigh, "I never expected the final winner to be you." Klein wiped the smile from his face as he inwardly grumbled, "It's only right that I win over the 2 of you." On the one hand, Admiral Amirius enjoys pressuring others and doesn't really rely on his beyonder powers to cheat. As for you, you placed your focus and beyonder powers on Admiral Amirius, thus, ignoring me. On the other hand, the one playing cards with you is actually named Winner Anuni. Without even looking at his whole cards, it was obvious that he was relying solely on luck. At the moment he placed his chip on the whole cards, Klein had already swapped positions with Anuni as they switched faces with each other. Although Colonel Calvin had gotten him to deliberately lose £1,000, Klein decided to win a killing after he saw Konas Kilgore. This wasn't because he couldn't bear to part with the money, instead, his main motive was to garner the attention of this Mi-9 demigod. He wanted to get familiar with him and build relationships. Only by doing this could Klein have an opportunity to obtain intelligence from Konas Kilgore and even carry out an assault on him. After all, he was a demigod. To deal with him in Backland required sufficient care and caution. He would rather give up an operation if he lacked the confidence to guarantee a kill or lure him away from Backland. Otherwise, he was bound to expose himself, ending up being surrounded by demigods and even angels in Backland. In the subsequent rounds, Klein won and lost different rounds. In the end, not only did he keep his £1,000 in chips, but he had even won nearly an additional £1,000. During this process, Calvin had gestured to Dwayne Dantes to lose, but he was left stupefied by the latter's ridiculous good luck that left him undefeatable. After the game came to an end, a person walked over to Dwayne Dantes with a smile, Konas Kilgore. 1 big blind is equal to the minimum bet. 2 the small blind is normally half the big blind. Chapter 998 Establishing Relations with Dark Blue Eyes. Konas Kilgore, who had crew-cut hair which was seldom seen among members of high society, held a cup of champagne as he walked up to Dwayne Dantes. He said with a smile, "You had great luck today. You also had plenty of courage." One if he's referring to me immediately folding after receiving a bribe, with me rather losing a big blind, that's not luck but knowledge. As for the other times, playing cards with all of you has pretty much drained all of Anuni's recently accumulated good luck. Klein swirled the cup with pale golden alcohol in his hand and said with a laughing sigh, "For a person who doesn't care about the outcome, there's naturally nothing to fear." "Heh, praise the lady." He was using a loan-style euphemism to indicate that he was mainly here to lose money and that his good luck was all thanks to the blessings of a deity. It had nothing to do with himself. Konas hadn't lost much tonight, approximately 1 to 200 pounds. Although this was already a considerable amount when compared to his purported salary, to a Brigadier General Deputy Director of MI9, a hidden demigod, his salary was the most trivial part of his income. Therefore, he didn't mind it. He shook his head with a smile. Humans often have no way of seeing through the arrangement of fate. "You are an interesting person. It's a pleasure to meet you." His final sentence was both a form of praise and also a part of the formalities. It indicated that their conversation was over. However, Klein had acted all night to acquaint himself with this demigod of the Black Emperor pathway, so how could he give up? He first replied, "It's my pleasure as well." Then, he asked in a seemingly random manner, "Your Excellency, are you familiar with the manners in the Backland suburbs? It's best if they come with forests for hunting." According to the information Klein had received from Miss Justice, Konas Kilgore didn't enjoy holding banquets, balls, or saloons at his place. Neither did he accept invitations on such matters. It was unknown if it was a problem with his character or due to his job. He had very simple hobbies. First, he enjoyed smoking cigars, especially Chieftain cigars from East Balam's Mycant, recognized as the best cigars in the world. Second, he enjoyed playing cards, especially Texas Hold'em. Third, he enjoyed hunting. He often headed to the Backland suburbs during autumn and winter. He even headed to Ottawa County or Eastchester County for hunting. Klein was already planning on buying a manor, an expenditure meant solely to integrate himself into high society. He hadn't made any decisions yet, but after meeting Konas Kilgore today, he suddenly added this request in a bid to garner his interest. When the time came, he could even invite this MI9 deputy director to hunt in the suburbs over an enjoyable weekend. He could then seek out an opportunity to take action. Konas Kilgore drank a mouthful of champagne and said after some thought, "I'll help you take note of it. If there's anything suitable, I'll send someone over." "Buckland Street, right?" "Yes, someone will inform you there." "Thank you very much," Klein earnestly replied. At the same time, he pitied his former valet, Richardson, who had now become an assistant butler. This young man who wished to better himself recently went out early in the morning and returned late at night. He had been gathering information about manors in Backland suburbs, filtering out those that met the requirements and the ones which were on sale. He had been personally visiting them in a bid to list down options which were all flawless. He didn't wish for his employer to spot something he fancied only to find out that it wasn't for sale, or that the actual conditions were far worse what was described. And after Klein suddenly changed his request, all the work that Richardson had done was undoubtedly made useless. The all-evil party in contracts always changes their requirements and requests. "Yes, after this is done, I'll get Taneja to raise his annual salary by £5. As an assistant butler, he should naturally earn more than his time as a valet. £5. It was gone in just 1 or 2 raises in today's game. Richardson's annual salary is only enough to play a few rounds of Texas Hold'em. Klein sighed inwardly when he sensed eyes looking at him. He directly looked back and realized that it was Admiral Emerius Revolt. This old-fashioned and stern middle-aged man nodded gently and retracted his gaze. He had no intentions of communicating with Dwayne Dantes, nor did he get anyone to arrest this unaffiliated beyonder. After all, he was considered a working partner of the military, and it wasn't rare for a merchant, an adventurer with wide connections, to be able to obtain a potion. At this moment, Colonel Calvin and Member of Parliament Mocht walked over to Dwayne Dantes with wine glasses in hand. "What happened?" Calvin asked with an exasperated and suppressed voice. As Dwayne Dantes had won nearly £1,000, he and Mocht had to change their strategies to prevent Admiral Emerius from losing any money. They went from a tight strategy to an unrestrained one. They felt quite the pinch from losing several £100 each. As such, adding to everyone's losses, Admiral Emerius had won a total of nearly £300. With regards to this, Klein spread his hands. "I didn't even look at my whole cards." In between the lines, he meant that this was simply the blessings of some deity that controlled luck. At the moment, the deities, angels, and secret existences who had authority in the fate domain included, but were not limited to, the Evernight Goddess, the Fool, Snake of Mercury Will-Oseptin, Palez Zoroast, Blasphemer Amon, and Snake of Fate Ouroboros. "This is really such a vexing matter," Mocht said with a bitter smile while shaking his head. "Calvin and I don't even dare to return home after what we've lost." They had roughly lost about half their purported annual income. Dwayne Dantes, with grayed sideburns, revealed a surprised look. "When did you guys lose?" He then pointed at the pile of chips at his seat. "I just happened to retain the £1,000 I bought in at the beginning. The rest are yours, isn't that so?" Calvin and Mocht were taken aback as they exchanged looks. Then, they revealed smiles. "We must have counted wrongly due to the anxiety." Calvin gave an approving nod. Klein laughed and immediately changed the topic. He then began looking at supper that was placed on the coffee table beside him. City of Silver, in the spire of one of the Twin Towers. Derek Berg once again met the chief of the 6-member council, Colin Iliad. "You said that you have something you would like to ask me about?" Colin, who had quite a number of old scars on his face, calmly asked the youth who wasn't considered too tall. Derek bowed and replied frankly, "Yes, Your Excellency. In the advancement for Priest of Light, I need pure darkness, but once I do it, it will be extremely dangerous. I'm wondering if there are any solutions." Colin Iliad listened seriously before nodding. "You have to confirm one point, is it pure darkness, or darkness with zero light? These two concepts are very different. If it's the latter, you can obtain that in the Spire's underground dungeons. You've been there for some time, so you should know what I'm talking about." Derek had a deep fear for the Spire's dungeons because it was there that he first met Blasphemer Amon. Not only did he see the former captain of the expedition team, but he had even been parasitized. Unless it was necessary, he really didn't wish to recall it. At this moment, after receiving the chief's reminder, he began to slowly jolt his memories. He discovered that, under the spire, although each cell was given candles, one would have to wait for the guards to deliver food and medicine and ask for more once they finished burning. This didn't happen frequently, with it happening only thrice a day with the gaps in between being very long. And in such an environment, phenomena like the appearance of monsters and the vanishing of humans never appeared. Derek recalled that he had been in darkness with zero light for some time without encountering any danger. He pondered for a moment and hesitantly said, "The darkness with zero light at the bottom of the spire has external powers involved?" It was this power that prevented the darkness from making people disappear or producing monsters? Colin Iliad looked at the two swords that were hung up in a cross-like fashion on the wall. He looked up and sighed. "Yes, that's why it's called darkness with zero light, not pure darkness." Derek frowned slightly as he tried to recall. After a few seconds, he said without certainty, "If that's the case, the darkness outside the spire's basement isn't pure darkness as well." In many historical records, the nights before the Dark Ages didn't make people vanish or produce monsters. Now, the darkness must have undergone an abnormal change or had some other forces mixed into it to turn it dangerous. Not bad. For you to make such connections shows that you've improved. Therefore, let me ask you again. Do you need pure darkness or darkness with zero light? Colin's light blue eyes revealed a hint of surprise. Could it be that pure darkness only exists outside the forsaken land of the gods? Derek turned gloomy before he pumped himself up. Your Excellency, I'm not too sure either. I'll take some time to confirm this. He believed that the experienced and strong Mr. Hanged Man, Mr. World, and the other members of the Tarot Club could give him a good solution. Colin Iliad didn't ask further as he said with a nod, go on then. Once you reach Sequence 5, even if you aren't able to become a demigod for a long period of time, you will have the chance of wielding certain sealed artifacts. 1 Backlund, Hillston Borough, Zio changed into a brown jacket and wore a cap, pretending to be a very ordinary short man. She had officially taken the commission and had begun tailing and investing the gentleman named Ernst Boyar. There were also a few other bounty hunters who participated in this mission. Ernst Boyar lifted his top hat and pointed his cane forward as he instructed the carriage driver, to St. George Borough. It was southeast of Backlund, separated from East Borough by the Tussock River. Once he got on his carriage and took his seat, Ernst sniffed. He looked out the window and suddenly grunted. As a sanguine viscount, how could he not have discovered the clumsy bounty hunters tailing him? Chapter 999 Instigation. When Ernst left on a carriage, the few bounty hunters hiding in the vicinity immediately appeared. Without being stingy about the costs involved, they immediately stopped any rental carriages that passed by. Some memorized the target carriage's traits and attempted to take shortcuts through the cramped, isolated paths to catch up to it. Others rode on the bikes they had prepared ahead of time, swerving through the crowds and carriages with their bells ringing. It was very easy for them to keep pace. Among them, only Zio was completely composed. She remained in her spot, watching Ernst and her peers leave. This transportation tool known as a bicycle is more useful than I imagined. It's no wonder so many bounty hunters have saved up to buy one. This can save expenses from taking carriages and save time walking. If one often has such tracking missions, then the money saved is enough to buy a brand new bike. The only problem is that this mode of transportation tool has very few models available. All of them have high seats. Zio was enticed. At this moment, a tracked carriage drove over from the crossroads and stopped in front of her. Zio happened to be at a station. Glancing at the double-decker that stopped on the iron tracks, Zio took out a few pennies, walked over, and sat down by the window. Such public carriages could seat nearly 50 people with its double decks. It wasn't too crowded, allowing Zio to easily observe the scenery outside. However, she didn't admire the scenery. Her mind was quickly outlining the exact appearance of her target: brown hair, red eyes, pronounced features, a nose bridge that was so high that it looked deformed, and an oil painting catalogue in hand. With her supernatural senses as a sheriff, as well as the distance between them not being too great, Zio could vaguely grasp her target's current location and predetermined destination. Therefore, she remained very calm and even took off her cap while using the glass windows to tidy up her coarse and stubborn blonde hair. After several stations, Zio suddenly got up when the public carriage came to a stop as she alighted. This was the Backlund Bridge area. She had sensed that the target had already changed direction and was preparing to head towards the bridge. Zio immediately went on foot, planning to enter another street at the bend up ahead to board the public carriage that headed for the south bank of the Tussock River. She had good luck, with a public carriage driving over just as she arrived at the stop. Zio silently exhaled and took out another batch of pennies she had prepared, her urge to buy a bike strengthened. This tracked carriage was very crowded, but with her domineering aura as an arbiter, she was able to easily pass through the crowd, head up to the upper deck, and find a seat. The carriage moved slowly as Zio casually looked out the window when her gaze suddenly froze. She saw Sherman, who she hadn't been able to find anywhere. This young man who thought himself as a woman was carrying a paper bag with a few long loaves of bread and a stack of newspapers as he entered a narrow alley. His brown shoulder-length hair had grown longer, and his gray-patterned trousers seemed tighter. Although his figure disappeared almost as quickly as he appeared, making it impossible for the average person to notice, Zio, who was a sheriff, easily made the necessary judgment. Sherman stopped renting his place in Eastborough and moved here? Seeing that Sherman was fine and that she was still tracking her target, she held back her urge to jump off the carriage to chase after him to ask him about his recent situation. Sherman carried the paper bag with several long loaves of bread and a stack of papers as he passed through alleys and streets, making a huge detour before entering an apartment building. He followed the cramped stairs to the third story, took out a key, and opened the door to where he lived. He seemed to possess some pretty good anti-tracking skills. With a creak, the door opened as Sherman's eyes lit up. He saw a lady wearing a black dress in front of him. This lady had a sweet, supple face and an impeccable figure. Even while standing at the window and blocking out the sunlight, making herself become cloaked in the shadows, she seemed to be gilded, making her appear holy and beautiful. "Why are you here?" Sherman stared at her in surprise but couldn't help but size her up. His unobvious Adam's apple bobbed up and down as he swallowed a mouthful of saliva. The next second, he turned his head and looked to the side as though he didn't dare look at her head-on. "Ma'am T. Trissy," Sherman stammered a greeting. Trissy slowly smiled as she allowed the poorly lit room to appear to become brighter. Then, she asked with a teasing tone, "Why don't you dare to look at me?" I don't know. One like men. Why do I still have odd thoughts when looking at you?" Sherman continued looking at the ground to his side as he stammered an answer. Trissy's expression immediately turned mixed before smiling as though nothing had happened. Females can also appreciate the charm of beauty within their gender. She paused for a moment before saying, "I came here today because I have a mission for you. Your original progress has been very fast, leaving me very satisfied. But it seems like it has recently stopped." Sherman's face immediately wore a look of horror as he subconsciously took a step back. I don't think there's a need to do such things." Seeing Trissy silent, Sherman's gradually eloquently stringed his words. "I really don't wish to instigate others into stealing, robbing, and murdering. That's too evil, too despicable. Even at the very beginning, those people you got me to assassinate seemed to be a little overboard. Although they had indeed cursed me, beat me, ostracized me, and spread bad rumors about me, using all kinds of means to harm me in exchange for joy, their actions didn't require them to pay with their lives." Unsurprised, Trissy smiled and said, "That's not what you said back then. You hated them and had wicked feelings for them. Once you obtained beyonder powers, you were so eager to seek revenge on them. I just made a tiny suggestion, and you planned several assassination missions. I always remember how you looked stained with blood, trembling in excitement and fervor." Sherman couldn't help but retreat as he heard that until he was stopped by the door which had closed at some point in time. He then covered his face with his hands, shouting, "No. I have nightmares every night, dreaming of them surrounding me, covered in blood. They chase after me, bite me, paw." The paper bag fell to the ground as the long loaves of bread were scattered. The stack of newspapers happened to drop just beside them. "This is very normal." Trissy cut off Sherman. "This is a necessary psychological change for an assassin. Think about it. Didn't you wish to kill them when they were bullying you?" "Yes," Sherman answered hesitantly. Trissy then chuckled. "Just treat it as self-defense when being bullied, thus, killing them." Her speech had a natural allure that made one wish to listen and believe. Sherman rapidly calmed down and nodded. From this point of view, it does seem much better. Upon hearing that, Trissy's dimples appeared as she teasingly added, besides, they weren't your match when they were alive, so what's there to be afraid of when they're dead? Even if they become ghosts or specters, it's nothing. You just need to seriously complete the ritual and consume one more potion, and then you'll be able to burn all those souls to oblivion. But I can't bear seeing people turn ugly, crazy, and evil under my acts of instigation. Sherman still seemed rather unwilling. Trissy indiscernibly curled the ends of her lips as she said with her smile maintained, those are evil thoughts they had to begin with. It has nothing to do with you. Even without you, those evil thoughts will erupt at specific moments and situations. Also, the missions I arranged for you are all related to the gangs. Aren't you most aware of what those people are like? Getting them to fracture and kill one another is mercy and kindness for people like you and the innocent people of East Borough. Sherman subconsciously widened his mouth, swallowing the words he was just about to say. He instantly fell silent. Trissy's eyes swept past him and continued with a soothing voice, you're just one step away from your target. As long as you complete the remaining ritual, you can drink the third potion to completely become a woman. When that happens, you can use the name Shermaine that you've already picked for yourself. What a nice-sounding name it is, isn't it? Then, you can leave Backlund as a woman, heading for Mid-Seashire or Desi Bay where you can begin a brand new life. You will no longer have anything to do with this place. Yes, you will definitely be filled with charm. Many excellent men will court you, and you can choose the one you like the most and are most satisfied with, walking down the aisle in a cathedral. You will have bubbly kids, and you can bring them up to be healthy children. You can bring them to Winter County for skiing, Desi Bay for holidays, and to the hunting grounds which are pleasures that only nobles have. Didn't you say that you were willing to do anything to regain your true self? Sherman's lips quivered, and after pursing them tightly for a while, he separated them and said, Ma'am Trissy, I understand. I will proceed according to your instructions. After saying that, he seemed to lose all his strength as he stumbled to the ground. He subconsciously reached out to hold onto a coat rack beside him. During this process, his gaze happened to sweep past the stack of newspapers. It had already spread apart, revealing a particular report. Tycoon from Desi, Mr. Dwayne Dantes, shows interest in purchasing the Larry Way Steel Company, believing that it has excellent profitability and a promising future. Sir, are you really planning on buying Larry Way Steel Company? Enuni asked while walking upstairs at 160 Buckland Street. Dwayne Dantes shook his head and smiled. That news is just pure fabrication. I've only met the owner of the Larry Way Steel Company, Mr. Phil Larivi, at a ball last week and had a chat. By the side, Butler Walter heaved a sigh of relief as he warned, Sir, the Larry Way Steel Company is indeed seeking a buyer. There are quite a number of people who are considering the option. That also means that this piece of news was released by the reporters under Phil's instructions so that he can sell it at a better price? Klein nodded in thought. He entered the room with the half-balcony and prepared to head up above the grey fog. He wanted to use Enuni's praying point of light to see any abnormalities at Hazel's place. This was something that he had been doing daily for the past few days. Chapter 1000 Prelude in the Grand Palace above the grey fog. Through Enuni's prayer point of light, Klein saw the scene inside his valet's room. As his vision pulled out and slowly extended out, he began taking in all of Buckland Street. Among buildings covered in fresh flowers and grass, Intis parasol trees that shielded the sunlight slowly swept past. There were slow-moving carriages that were elegantly or beautifully adorned, and youths dashing quickly on bikes. Finally, Klein locked onto Unit 39, Member of Parliament Mock's residence. He then lowered his field of view and began observing every animal and human to see if there was any black-haired, black-eyed, monocle-wearing man. Phew! There's no switching or grafting of fate. Nearly 10 minutes later, Klein heaved a sigh of relief. At this moment, a carriage drove into Mock's residence and stopped at their doorstep. A young lady with curly black-green hair and bright, dark brown eyes alighted from a carriage. It was none other than Hazel, who had returned home. She was wearing a dark green dress that didn't expose her shoulders. Her lips were slightly pursed, and she wore a relaxed look with a hint of joy. Upon seeing Hazel in such a state, Klein's heart skipped a beat. This was definitely abnormal. From Klein's point of view, the rat demigod had only two outcomes after meeting Amon's avatar. She either had a trump card and managed to escape successfully at the cost of being heavily injured, or she had turned into a beyonder characteristic to strengthen Amon's avatar. And regardless of the outcome, there was no way Hazel could find her teacher. She would definitely be in grief and pain, feeling dispirited and sad. So how could she be relaxed and happy? With her taking the risk to head to the manor in the suburbs to inform her teacher, she's not a cold and selfish person. Her present state indicates that she has confirmed that her teacher, that rat demigod, is fine. She has even been rewarded, perhaps obtaining all kinds of knowledge about the supernatural world. This is in conflict with my theory of the rat demigod's outcome. No, it's not in conflict. Once you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, no matter how improbable, must be the truth. Klein leaned back into his seat and came to a conclusion. Amon had not only obtained the rat demigod's beyonder characteristic, but he had also stolen her fate and had replaced her identity. Therefore, to Hazel, her teacher hadn't encountered any mishaps and would only need a period of time to lie low. After making the confirmation, Klein silently exhaled and felt a little relaxed. To him, the most terrifying aspect of Amon was that no one knew what form or identity he would use to appear. It could be possible that Member of Parliament Mocked would one day wear a monocle, or that insects in the garden would turn around with monocles on their faces. Therefore, after grasping the identity Amon might use to appear, Klein couldn't help but feel more assured. As for Amon's performance being problematic in front of Hazel, Klein believed that it was impossible. After all, Amon was a king of angels that was fundamentally good at deceit. Even if he mentioned something that differed from what the rat demigod had said, he could easily use the excuse of it being a test with what he now said being part of her formal education to fool her. Of course, based on Pallas Zorost's depiction, Amon definitely wouldn't appear as a rat demigod, so I shouldn't be careless. Klein did some observations before retracting his gaze and leaving the grey fog. Inside his room, he sat on a reclining chair and drank some black tea with a lemon slice. He half closed his eyes and considered how he could deepen his relationship with Konas Kilgore. After an unknown period of time, Klein suddenly opened his eyes and activated his spirit vision. At the demigod level, he could already activate it at will. Almost at the same moment, Rionette Tynker walked out of the void with the four blonde, red-eyed heads in hand. One of them had a letter in its mouth. "Whose letter is it?" Klein asked as he reached out his right hand. "Sharon," Rionette Tynker's other head answered. "Miss Sharon? She should be making her final preparations for the advancement. Why would she suddenly write to me?" Klein was slightly puzzled as he received the envelope. After he opened it, he found very little content. There was only a simple line: Emlyn White is seeking out the Rose School of Thought. Emlyn is seeking out the Rose School of Thought? Klein pricked up his brows in surprise. His opinion of Emlyn was a sanguine who was afraid of trouble. Unless necessary, he didn't even wish to head out. So how could he actively search for the Rose School of Thought? This definitely isn't Emlyn's own will. Yes, Emlyn had mentioned that some important figure of the Sanguine was meeting him. This is a new mission that the Sanguine gave him? It's very possible. However, why didn't he mention it in the Tarot Club? Oh, it was focused on the punishment operation, and he had other clues, so he temporarily kept it from us? Klein thought as he leaned forward. Under the watch of Miss Messenger's 8 eyes, he took out a piece of paper and a fountain pen from his coffee table. He wasn't curious about Emlyn's clues, because it was an obvious matter. Since Miss Sharon knew that Emlyn was seeking out the Rose School of Thought and had asked their mutual friend, Detective Sherlock Moriarty, about this matter, it meant that this sanguine had likely asked the help of the black market arms dealer, Ian, from the Bravehearts bar. This also meant that, in Emlyn's previous commissions, he must have noticed Sharon or Merrick, otherwise, it was impossible for him to mention the Rose School of Thought to an ordinary person. I don't know enough about the apothecary pathway. I can't determine how Emlyn discovered a wraith or zombie. Klein crossed his right leg as he placed the letter on his thigh and began scribbling. This is likely a mission the Sanguine's upper echelons gave Emlyn. They hate the Rose School of Thought members who believe in the primordial moon, and they have directed this anger at the other factions of the Rose School of Thought. Upon writing this, Klein paused and added, I suspect that the Mother Tree of Desire has the intention of encroaching onto the authority of the Moon Domain, but I'm unsure why the primordial moon believers would join the Rose School of Thought. This secret existence seems to have a very complicated relationship with the Mother Tree of Desire. They are at odds, but they have also cooperated. It's hard to tell. Putting down his pen and folding the letter, Klein looked at Miss Messenger who had been waiting. He asked with a chortle, how did you know that I'll be replying? One of Rionette Tynker's heads succinctly answered, Inkling. Right on the heels of that, the four blonde, red-eyed heads spoke one after another. You, Seema, little livelier, recently, your expression, has also, become much richer. As Klein pulled out the box that was connected to his golden pocket watch, he took out a gold coin from it and said with a self-deprecating smile, repeatedly wearing a thick mask isn't good for one's mental health. I realized that after becoming a demigod. Therefore, unless he was in situations where he needed to disguise or hide his feelings, he limited the use of his clown's power to control his emotions. Rionette Tynker didn't say a word as the heads bit on the gold coin and letter before vanishing. Watching Miss Messenger leave, Klein leaned back slightly and inwardly muttered, I wonder if Miss Sharon and Merrick will use the Sanguine to deal with the Rose School of Thought members in Backlund. Miss Sharon is probably focusing her time and efforts on her advancement. She might not involve herself, but I can't be sure about Merrick. Emlyn changed into his Church of Earth Mother priest robes, and then wore a red coat and a silk hat before walking out the Harvest Church. He then got into a rental carriage by the roadside. After saying his destination, he casually cast his gaze out the window. At this moment, Emlyn sensed something as he abruptly moved his body, leaving shadowy afterimages in his wake as he moved to the side. Then, he saw a figure appear out of nowhere. It was a young man whose coat wasn't buttoned, revealing the white shirt and black vest within. His brown hair was a little moist and messy as though he hadn't combed it in a while. His brown eyes were filled with temperance, as though he was restraining certain urges deep within his heart. Upon seeing this pale corpse-like face, Emlyn tipped his chin and said with a smile, showing no signs of nervousness, You have finally come. Aren't you afraid that I'm a member of the Rose School of Thought that's here to finish you off? The young man's figure turned somewhat transparent. Emlyn scoffed and said, Would I not be aware of the Rose School of Thought's history? Or matters about the betrayal of the Temperance faction and their escape? Well, how do I address you? Merrick, the young man replied. Is this the information you received from the upper echelons of the Sanguine? Emlyn was taken aback as he sked. You are smarter than I thought. He used such a remark to confirm the other party's guess. Merrick slowly drew a breath and leaned forward slightly. How did you notice our existence from Ian's side? Emlyn leisurely leaned back into the carriage and said with a smile, Humans have the smell of humans. Wraiths have the smell of wraiths. Merrick fell silent for a few seconds before asking, You Sanguine wish to deal with the Rose School of Thought members in Backlund? The important members, Emlyn replied by making an emphasis. If that's the case, we can use ourselves as bait to help you fish out the Rose School of Thought members. However, I need confirmation. Merrick rubbed his eyes and said directly, I know you are unable to make the decision. You can first return to seek permission from the Sanguine. After you obtain their assurance, you know where to find us." Having said that, he handed a dossier in his hand. "This is from Ian. It's the initial feedback from tracking Ernst Boyar. Many bounty hunters have completed this together." Emlyn received the dossier and nodded in a rare look of solemnity. "Okay." Chapter 1001 First movement. When the wraith in front of him was gone, Emlyn White retracted his gaze, untied the thread on the dossier, and pulled out the documents inside. As he read through them, Emlyn had a rough idea of Ernst Boyar's routine. This sanguine viscount had a routine which was rather random: staying at home, out visiting exhibitions, partaking in wine tasting at manors in the city outskirts, shopping at department stores with female companions, or sketching female models. He was like the typical wealthy man. However, Ernst had recently been visiting St. George Borough every other day to monitor the renovations of the furniture factory he had invested in. It was a bid to ensure that it could quickly resume work. This way, the sanguine viscount's lifestyle became repetitive. The places he visited, the paths he took, and the places he had lunch were repeated every other day. Emlyn pressed down on his temples, seriously filtering out 3 venues which were suitable for the operation. The first was inside or at the entrance of the furniture factory owned by Ernst Boyar. The second was St. Ireland Square, where he stopped along the way home for a meal and to feed birds. The third place was Backlund Bridge. Unless Ernst was willing to take a huge detour, he had to pass by this area when traveling between his home and St. George Borough. These 3 spots meet the requirement of having plenty of people, making it chaotic. However, Backlund Bridge has too few entrances and exits. With the 2 ends locked down, one can only leave by jumping into the river, an act only chosen by idiots. St. Ireland Square comes under St. Ireland Cathedral, core to the Church of Steam in Backlund, and even the entirety of Lone. It's akin to the Second Holy See. It meets Mr. Hanged Man's suggestion. It can effectively prevent conflicts from escalating, and it can interfere with any subsequent divination and investigations. Emlyn gradually had an inclination. And once a living being had an inclination, they would unknowingly seek more reasons to affirm their choice, and Emlyn was no exception, without a doubt. The more he thought about it, the more he was convinced that St. Ireland Square met almost all the requirements. First, Ernst wouldn't stay in the area for too long. He would have lunch at a restaurant with Civilau's cuisine since he was born in Civilau's County. Secondly, there were several tracked carriage stops in the vicinity, making the area filled with traffic on foot. With most of them being people from the lower or middle class, accidents often happened. Thirdly, with it as the origin, one would enter the area south of the bridge if one didn't head to the Backlund Bridge. It would then be close by to the Harvest Church. Finally, at noon, the St. Ireland Cathedral would spew steam, turn its levers, and chime a clock. It was inevitable for everyone's attention to be attracted. "It's confirmed." Emlyn quickly made up his mind. Raising his right hand and adjusting his bow tie, his red eyes were filled with anticipation. At this moment, he suddenly frowned, sensing that something wasn't right. St. Ireland Square was just perfect for the job. It was so suitable that almost all the conditions were met. Will Ernst be wary against my revenge? Why would he allow himself to stay in such an environment for such long periods of time? Even if he's stupid enough to not realize it, wouldn't the Earls warn him? The corners of Emlyn's mouth curled up slightly as he understood the reason. St. Ireland Square was the venue the sanguine upper echelons had designated for him. Heh! Emlyn chuckled, keeping his mouth curled. He decided to request Mr. Fool to have a gathering for the few members and also invite Mr. Hanged Man to discuss the plan in detail. This was different from the framework that they had previously decided upon. They needed to consider every detail and consider every problem. At 15 minutes to 12, St. George Borough, St. Ireland Square. In a private room on the third story of a restaurant northwest of the square. A figure stood in front of the window, holding a cup filled with scarlet blood-like liquid. He was leisurely looking at the fountain nearby and the crowds that came and went. He was a lanky person, wearing a formal suit meant for banquets. His light-colored hair that was nearly silver and his bright red eyes combined together to give him a sense of coquettish handsomeness. There was a constant faint smile lining his lips. "My lord, will it really be fine? Emlyn seems to be different from before." This can be seen from his recent hunt of the primordial moon believers. A middle-aged man in a dark suit walked to the window and said with some hint of worry. The man who had been politely addressed cast his gaze at the square where Emlyn White stood. He was listening to a violinist busking on the street as he chuckled. "Our preparations are enough even against a demigod, much less a kid who hasn't even become a viscount. Besides, we don't really plan on doing anything serious. Our only goal is to identify and make confirmations. This is a lot simpler than preventing certain people from escaping." As he spoke, the man with the light hair and bright red eyes raised his right hand slightly, rotating the ring on his left ring finger. The ring was made of silver, and embedded in it was a strange gem with a ghostly blue hue. On a carriage driving toward St. Hireland Square, Ernst Boyar had his right hand over his left. He naturally rotated the ring on his ring finger that had a ghostly blue gem embedded in it. He casually looked out the window and saw a trackless carriage slowly drive over from afar. A paperboy slightly taller than 160 centimeters had a sling bag across his chest as he peddled his papers along the street. Quite a number of bicycles had replaced the carriages that were often seen last year. They darted through the crowds in St. George Borough. Here, the number of workers wearing light blue or grayish-blue uniforms with hats had far exceeded the number of people in formal suits and top hats. Ernst retracted his gaze as he chuckled. He had no fear about what would happen next. He even looked forward to it. He believed that he had made enough preparations. He wore Oath of Rose on his left hand. It allowed him to share what he saw, heard, and smelled with Earl Mistral from a distance away. It made sure that nothing would go wrong while ensuring that their objective was met. In his inner pocket where his silver pocket watch was, there was a moon paper figurine. These could suffer a single lethal blow or an attack that targeted his sole body. It ensured that he wouldn't suffer any serious injuries or death within a short span of time. He also wore Alcohol Nemesis, a diamond brooch. It kept him brimming with energy with lucidity in his thoughts. It raised his resistance against spells that acted on the body of heart and mind. By his waist was a belt named Moonlight Sash. It could effectively reduce sun and lightning damage. These mystical items were the accumulation of Ernst's wealth or were bestowed by Earl Mistral. It made sure that Ernst was a target that could hardly be quickly finished off or controlled. With the Sanguine Viscount's natural resistance against nightmare-type influences, Ernst was nearly without weakness. Even against a demigod, he could put up a fight as long as the latter didn't reveal their mythical creature form. The only problem is that the negative effects of all these mystical items are quite excessive. Ernst's facial muscles twitched, but he quickly composed himself. The Oath of Rose would make his thoughts appear in Earl Mistral's mind from time to time. And if he kept wearing it for a week without removing it, the pair who had the matching rings might very well end up in love, regardless of gender or race. Moon paper figurine was an expendable item. It had nearly zero side effects apart from making the body slightly cold. The Alcohol Nemesis brooch's problem was that it would deal continuous damage to one's liver and brain. If it was worn for excessively long periods of time, it might result in one losing one's thoughts and logical reasoning. Therefore, one had to take it off for 15 minutes after every half an hour of equipping it. Once Moonlight Sash was worn, it made all senses much sharper, making it easy for one to see and hear things one shouldn't see or hear. At the same time, the wearer would feel itchy at intermittent intervals. Let's hope they don't cower in fear and that this doesn't drag on. Ernst Boyar checked on his condition once again, casting his gaze of anticipation at the St. Hierland Square's entrance nearby. On the other end of St. Hierland Square, Emlyn White, who was taking in the sights of the buskers on the streets, suddenly looked up at a bird that flew over. Following that, he raised his hand to press down on his top hat. Bowing his head slightly, he briskly walked to the middle of the square, approaching the fountain. In this process, Emlyn's figure kept moving as he mixed into the crowd. However, this failed to avoid Earl Mistral's tracking. This sanguine earl with silver hair rotated the ghostly blue gem ring on his left ring finger and coldly said, "Take note." At the entrance of St. Hierland Square, Ernst Boyar grew increasingly pumped. He knew that the operation was about to come finally. Emlyn still chose St. Hierland Square after all. Ernst cast his gaze out the window once more, warily watching the pedestrians on the street, the trackless public carriages that were about to pass him, the ordinary paperboy who was peddling his papers, and the elegant windows of the surrounding houses and shops. He didn't believe that Emlyn's potential partners were hiding in there, because there were even more, better spots in St. Hierland Square that made it conducive to take action. However, he still kept up the required level of wariness. Suddenly, his body lunged forward slightly as he nearly got out of his seat. The carriage he was on had stopped without any warning. Right on the heels of that, the horses that pulled the carriage seemed to be in a nightmare as they raised their front hooves, struggling wildly, flipping the carriage to the ground. During this process, Ernst Boyar actually had ample space, time, and strength to help the carriage driver control the berserk horse. However, he didn't do so, because he saw a transparent wolf-shaped specter jump over from outside the window. It had thrown a rose within its body. A rose. Ernst Boyar's eyes widened as the carriage toppled. He hurriedly jumped to the side and out the carriage as he made an illusory and incorporeal black chain extend out of the void. It wrapped around the wolf-shaped specter. With a soft poof, the wolf-shaped specter dissipated without a struggle. And when Ernst Boyar found his footing, he stood there motionless, his eyes turbid. He had already been pulled into a deep sleep. In a trackless public carriage that passed him by, a black-haired, green-eyed young man wore a thin trench coat. His back was facing the middle of the street as he focused on reading a notebook with a green bronze hardcover. Around him, the other passengers were either reading the papers or chatting. Some were looking out only to see the berserk horse quickly recover. With a whoosh, the black-haired, green-eyed man flipped the page of the notebook. The trackless carriage continued forward and gradually distanced itself. Chapter 1002 Second Movement St. Hierland Square, in the northwestern corner, at the third story of a restaurant. When the wolf spectre with the rose appeared in front of Ernst Boyar, the silver-haired, scarlet-eyed Mistral retracted his gaze from Ernst Boyar. Darkness suffused from behind him as countless tiny bats flew within. Bribe. Just as this sanguine earl silently muttered this single word, he saw the toppled carriage, heard the neighing of the horse, and smelled all kinds of smells. However, he wasn't able to instantly find the origin of the disturbance and accident. At this moment, his vision darkened as his eyes seemed to lose the ability to take in light. The din in his ears also halted. Earl Mistral chortled inwardly as he immediately fused with the bats behind him, rematerializing beside Ernst Boyar. Suddenly, in his black vision, a point of light appeared. This point of light rapidly expanded as it grew brighter and brighter. A golden figure with 12 pairs of pitch-black wings walked out of it. The pairs of wings spread out, blanketing Mistral's vision, causing light and darkness to mix. This created mysterious and complicated symbols that didn't differentiate themselves within the golden figure. It was both holy and corrupted, both light and dark. Angel. Mistral's pupils widened slightly as he couldn't help but take a step back, terminating his previous thoughts. In confusion, Ernst Boyar rapidly snapped awake when he saw a pair of limpid eyes that resembled crystalline gems or a lake. He felt a copy of the newspapers being stuffed into his hand. In those emerald-green eyes were ripples. Deep within the emanating ripples were twirls of a vortex that seemed to suck in the soul of anyone who lay their eyes on them. Ernst Boyar instantly became engrossed in it as he couldn't move his eyes away. Then, he heard a gentle and ethereal female voice in his ears, "Take this newspaper and follow Emlyn White. Take this newspaper and follow Emlyn White." This voice was layered as it resounded within Ernst Boyar's ears. It drilled into his brain, sinking deep into his heart. Ernst Boyar nodded in a daze, sensing that there was more, but he couldn't hear it clearly. The paperboy with a sling bag diagonally across his shoulders swiftly turned around and agilely passed through the bicycles, mixing into the crowd that came and went. This boy had a pretty face as his messy hair drooped down and hid his brows. As he walked, he took off a black fishnet glove that he had worn at some point in time, stuffing it into his sling bag filled with newspapers. As the wind blew, his clothes shrank as a spot on his exposed arm protruded out. A few seconds later, Ernst Boyar suddenly jumped back from where he stood, doing so as though he had been trying to dodge something. No good. I was influenced by a nightmare's ability. Just as he found his footing, his pupils dilated as he looked around his surroundings in a state of high alert, prepared for any impending attacks. Although Ernst Boyar was perplexed about how easily he was pulled into a dream, he knew that it wasn't time to consider the details. What followed next was key. He couldn't afford to be distracted. Ring! A few bicycles passed him as they used their bells to warn the gentleman in the middle of the road to make way. Ernst Boyar narrowed his eyes as he glared at him, his muscles under his clothes ready to deliver their might. I.e. these few bicycles circled around him as the pedestrians came and went, some slowing down their footsteps and pointing their fingers. Gong! 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 12 gongs were heard as the white steam spewed out from the chimneys of St. Ireland Cathedral. The holy hymns of praise resounded as the gears and levers got to work. On the square, everyone stopped in their footsteps. At that holy moment, they either closed their eyes in prayer or were listening silently, regardless of whether they were believers of the god of steam and machinery or not. Only the pigeons that were being fed flew up and soared into the sky. Gong gong! Gong! As the gong sounded, no one moved. Even Earl Mistral, who was inside a private room at the restaurant, stood there motionless with a heavy expression. His vision had already recovered, but all he saw was workers wearing grayish-blue or light blue clothes and bicycles of the same make. Apart from that, he discovered nothing. Furthermore, Ernst Boyar hadn't been injured at all. Of course, he had guessed that the paperboy was problematic from the newspaper in the Sanguine Viscount's hand. However, he didn't attempt to carry out a pursuit. Clearly, the power that had borrowed the level of an angel didn't belong to a low or mid-sequence beyonder. This also meant that Emlyn White's faction had at least a demigod hidden in the vicinity. Mistral believed that once he took action, he was bound to be stopped or even incur retaliation. In a situation of being easily detected while not knowing where his opponents were hiding, Mistral believed that it spelled trouble. Carrying out a pursuit in such cases only exacerbated the matter. Furthermore, to the Sanguine, this was only a test. If the faction backing Emlyn had mobilized a demigod, they could detain that powerhouse thanks to Ernst Boyar's protective measures. And through Oath of Rose, Mistral could confirm the attacker's identity. They had never thought of escalating the matter into an intense conflict. In their plans, it only involved Earl Mistral stopping the other party to prevent Ernst Boyar from suffering any harm. In the present situation, they had lost the initiative. To forcefully carry out a pursuit might highly likely result in a demigod's battle. And in Backlund, around St. Ireland Cathedral, this was equivalent to suicide. Besides, to Mistral, since the other demigod hadn't personally taken action and had only provided auxiliary help, to personally take action and make a pursuit would be a loss of decorum and an insult to his reputation as a sanguine earl. Humph. I want to see what happens next. Mistral's facial muscles twitched as he rotated the ghostly blue ring on his left hand once more. After the 12 gongs, Emlyn started walking again. He circled past the fountain and arrived at the other end of St. Hireland Square amidst the landing pigeons. He then saw Ern's boyar, who had his back hunched slightly, afraid to even move half a step. He saw the toppled carriage, the horse that was flicking its tail, and the carriage driver who wore a look of pain. Emlyn walked over, took out a wallet, and pulled out £100. He handed it to the carriage driver and said, "This is your compensation." The carriage driver wore a blank but pleasantly surprised look. The rental carriage wasn't his. He was only an ordinary employee. After the carriage was damaged because of the horse being startled, he experienced a brief moment of feeling the pinch. Following that, it was anxiousness and despair that ruled over his mind. Based on the so-called contract and other similar accidents he had seen over the years, he was responsible for all of this. This meant compensation from him and, with his income and family situation, meant bankruptcy. During that short moment, all kinds of thoughts had surfaced in the carriage driver's mind. They were mainly of 3 types. One was to scare the frozen gentleman and get him to pay compensation. This prevented his family from falling apart, with his children having to slave away at the factories at a young age. Another option was to immediately bring the horse to a gangster and sell it. Then, he would return home and leave Backlund with his wife and children. The last option was to arrange for his family to move from the place they rented. He would then plead with the owner of the carriage, hoping that he could repay it in installments. If the person wasn't agreeable, he would rather be thrown into jail than reimburse him a single penny. Now, having £100 suddenly hit him left his mind groggy. He was at a loss for words. £100 was enough to buy a brand new rental carriage and even more. Emlyn ignored the carriage driver and looked at Ernst. "Everything's fine now. Aren't you the biggest problem? How can it be fine with you here?" Ernst lampooned as he rotated the ring with the ghostly blue gem on his left hand. For some unknown reason, he felt that he should believe Emlyn White and even approach him. Emlyn shot a glance, suddenly turned around, and walked briskly into an alley. Ernst subconsciously opened up his stride and followed closely behind. He kept holding onto the newspaper in hand. The 2 sanguine moved at extremely fast speeds, with one running and the other chasing. However, they didn't dare reveal anything extraordinary. When Earl Mistral sensed that the 2 sanguine were beyond the reach of his spirituality, he used the connection between the paired oath of rose rings to follow behind unhurriedly. Emlyn occasionally made detours, taking shortcuts and occasionally returning to spots they had been before. It made it difficult to guess where his destination was. As for Ernst, he was like a bull having seen a red cloth. He refused to give up as he followed closely behind. Unknowingly, the 2 sanguine arrived at Rose Street, which was south of the bridge. At this moment, Emlyn suddenly sped up. He wasn't afraid that others saw him producing after-images as he dashed right into the Harvest Church. Ernst did the same. Not good. From afar, Earl Mistral was just about to descend upon them to stop the subsequent developments when Ernst's figure vanished inside the Harvest Church's entrance. Gotcha. A tile at Mistral's foot instantly shattered. After entering the cathedral, Ernst came to a realization. He then saw a figure wearing a brown priest robe stand up at the front of all the rows of pews. He appeared like a mountain. At the same time, the entire cathedral turned heavy as if it was a jail. It seemed to fuse with the land itself. Ernst's mind buzzed immediately as another voice sounded in his mind. "After you awaken from the first hypnosis, throw all the items on you to Emlyn White." Amidst shuffling sounds, Ernst took off his sash, threw out the brooch, and slammed the various items towards Emlyn White. This included his silver pocket watch and a wallet filled with cash. Pa! The newspaper in his hand fell to the ground, throwing out a paper card that was stuffed within. On the paper card was the goddess of justice sitting on a chair and holding a sword and scale. It was the tarot card, Justice. Chapter 1003. Ritornello. After throwing everything other than his clothes, Ernst Boyar was stunned for a moment before he snapped to his senses. What am I doing? What did I do? This sanguine Viscount finally recalled the matters he had deliberately forgotten, those pair of emerald green, limpid eyes. A psychological cue, no, hypnosis. Ernst Boyar looked around in anger and irresistible horror, instinctively taking in the situation he was in. His gaze then landed on the mountain-like figure. He saw Father Yatravsky with his thin and sparse brows. Instantly, Ernst Boyar had all sorts of thoughts run through his mind and collide with one another. He quickly came up with one intense thought. He didn't put up any resistance, and he immediately said, "I'll come here to do a month of volunteer work." Emlyn's predicament had long been spread amongst the sanguine in Backlund. Ernst Boyar was well aware of Father Yatravsky and knew that, even if he were to put up a fight, it was difficult for him to escape the fate of doing volunteer work. He might as well surrender and choose conditions that were more beneficial to him. At the very least, I shouldn't have any cues planted in my mind and end up converting my faith to Earth Mother. This thought flashed through Ernst's mind. He discovered a lantern in Yatravsky's hand, and inside it was a strange candle that seemed to be covered in human skin with protruding lumps. Under the candlelight's faint illumination, Ernst's pupils widened again. He only had one thought on his mind remaining as it kept resonating, another psychological cue. At that moment, he felt the gloominess thicken in his heart. All right, Yatravsky nodded and agreed to Ernst Boyar's request. Emlyn held back his smugness and pleased smile. He then looked at the items he had caught, looking like a farmer who had just reaped a bountiful harvest. In a private room on the third story of a restaurant northwest of the square, the lights darkened as a huge shadow appeared. Tiny bats flew out of the darkness and quickly clumped together. Smoke rose up as the silver-haired, scarlet-eyed Earl Mistral appeared at the spot where the bats had appeared. Everything around him had been restored to normal. His servant, a middle-aged man in a dark formal suit, immediately stepped forward and asked with a bow, "My lord, are you having your meal now?" He couldn't tell if things had happened smoothly, or if something had gone wrong, much less about the success of the outcome from the Earl's face. However, he didn't dare inquire. Mistral nodded and said, "Yes." He walked to the table with a composed look, took off the ring with the ghostly blue gem, and sat down without showing a chink in his disposition. It was as though he had headed out to feed the pigeons. This rich smell is rather unique, but it's not bad. In the private room neighboring Earl Mistral, Klein was wearing a very ordinary face as he commented on the Civilau's cuisine delicacy, lamb tripe. This punishment operation was an attempt by the few members of the Tarot Club, one that didn't need the world or Mr. Fool's interference, but considering how Miss Justice and the Moon Emlyn had zero experience in such matters and lacked experience in other matters, he had come to the area incognito as a final safeguard. He had previously used his marionette to pray to the Fool while he entered the attached bathroom of his private room to head above the grey fog. Using the corresponding point of light, he had taken in the entire square and its surroundings. He kept holding the sea god scepter the entire time, prepared to deliver a lightning strike to prevent any problems once he discovered anything amiss. However, he ultimately didn't do a thing. Everything happened more smoothly than he imagined. There was no need for him to consider the experience the Star Leonard, but Miss Justice, who was participating in such matters for the first time, had exceeded his expectations. She wasn't nervous at all, not showing any signs of panic. Indeed. A sequence 6 of the spectator pathway is far greater than low and mid-sequence beyonders of the other pathways when it comes to controlling emotions. Even if she felt uneasy, she would have resolved it with her beyonder powers before the operation. Klein nodded indiscernibly as he continued sampling the other delicacies. Outside the window, on St. Hireland Square, it became filled with lively music, an eclectic mix of the flute, violin, accordion, and seven-string guitar. A rental carriage was slowly circling around the perimeter of St. Hireland Square. Leonard Mitchell, who was prepared to return to the north bank of the Backlund Bridge, took one look at the pigeons in the middle of the square before asking with a suppressed voice, "Old man, what's your take regarding the outcome of this operation?" After he pulled Ernst Boyar into a dream, he flipped Lameno's Travels and activated Angel's Embrace. He then left the scene on carriage, unsure of the subsequent developments. In his mind, Pallas Zoroast snapped back, "In the fourth epoch, there's such a saying, believe in the might of deities. This means that this matter has received the tacit approval of Mr. Fool, so it's bound to succeed?" However, Old Man doesn't know much about the Tarot Club. Mr. Fool is a witness most of the time, so there's no so-called tacit approval. Leonard mumbled inwardly before diverting the topic, why doesn't this saying feel complete? He had never informed Pallas Zoroast of the exact situation of the Tarot Club. All he did was give mention of the general situation of the Tarot Club and inform him of the matters that had been approved by Mr. Fool. Pallas chuckled and said, "Indeed. There's also a second half of the saying, do not trust their benevolence. Believe in the might of deities, but do not trust their benevolence." Leonard repeated in silence as he looked down at the notebook with a bronze hardcover. He then muttered wistfully, "This is really akin to a Grade 1 sealed artifact. Furthermore, resolving its negative effects is relatively simple." Before this operation, consideration was given to the fact that beyonders of the pathway involving the moon domain, as well as the darkness, had relatively stronger resistance against nightmare-related effects. Leonard had originally planned on borrowing Creeping Hunger from the World Klein Moretti. However, after some subsequent discussion, Miss Magician mentioned the traits of Lameno's Travels, giving him a better option. Hence, Klein, who was originally responsible for Angel's Embrace, lent him Creeping Hunger for 3 hours. Various useful beyonder powers were recorded, such as bribe, weaken. "This is something from the Abraham family," Pallas Zoroast said with a sigh. Leonard had long known of this as he nodded indiscernibly. He then asked, "Old man, do you have the means of weakening or controlling the negative effects of the mystical item I previously mentioned?" "You call that a mystical item? That's something that requires sealing." Pallas first reprimanded Leonard. Then, he said, "Didn't you say that it has a living characteristic? That makes it much easier to resolve." Leonard felt relieved as he cast his gaze out the window again, taking in the sight of St. Hireland Cathedral, which had parts resembling factories. In Phelps Street, Northborough, in the vicinity of St. Samuel Cathedral, at the entrance of the Lone Charity Bursary Foundation. After changing her clothes, Audrey got off a carriage like an ordinary girl. She had already gotten rid of her paperboy attire at a hotel room that had been prepared ahead of time. And that room was reserved by someone under Emlyn's instructions. It had nothing to do with her. At this moment, there were people coming and going at the Lone Charity Bursary Foundation's entrance, but Audrey walked over without any hesitation. No one looked at her, as though she lived in another world. Audrey briskly walked into the foyer, went up to the second story, and headed for the director's office. And everyone who she walked past seemed to join her in playing a game, pretending as though they hadn't seen her. They weren't puzzled about why this unfamiliar girl was inside. Audrey was just about to enter the office when she suddenly heard a familiar voice inside, "Miss Audrey, this is the amount of donations we have gathered this week." Audrey couldn't help but curl the ends of her lips as she gently nudged the ajar door and walked in. Inside the office, a staff member was holding a stack of documents, showing it to the person behind the desk. Sitting behind the desk was a golden retriever with a pair of gold-rimmed glasses hanging by her neck. It sat at the director's seat, casually flipping through the documents, and said, "That wouldn't be an issue." The staff member then took back the document and smiled at the golden retriever. "Then, I'll take my leave, Miss Audrey." Behind her, Audrey held back her laughter as she walked to the sofa. She silently watched the staff member leave without interrupting the golden retriever from reading the other documents. Susie seriously read the different documents, afraid that something wrong would happen to her acting, thus, affecting Audrey's matters. After a while, she suddenly looked around in puzzlement. "Audrey, are you back? How did you notice?" Audrey stood up from the sofa and appeared within Susie's sights. For this operation, she had specially spoken to Susie. She got the latter to replace her at work in the Lone Charity Bursary Foundation. Then, with the golden retriever in tow, she hypnotized all the staff members who would interact with her that day, making them treat Susie as Audrey. As for any possible visitors, she told her staff that there would only be guests in the afternoon. And the signal to snap out of the hypnosis was the cathedral bells at 2 in the afternoon. Susie jumped off the chair after seeing Audrey, saying in exasperation, "It's almost 2. That's right." Audrey inwardly made a silly face as she rushed into the small lounge and changed into her clothes. She then used Li's flame-controlling powers to bomb her previous disguise. After returning to her office and sitting at her seat, she felt completely relaxed. She clasped her hands together and lightly pursed her lips. To be frank, she had always been nervous. However, she had successfully cast Placate on herself before the operation, preventing any slip-ups. It's quite interesting now that I reminisce over it. We even discussed how we would compensate those who were affected. Audrey, well done. A smile beamed on the blonde, green-eyed beauty as it grew brighter. After this operation, she realized that her hypnotist potion had digested by a significant amount. Furthermore, she had also confirmed one thing: the mystical item, Hand of Horror, which came with bribe, charm worked perfectly with hypnosis. Yes, I also learned that Mr. Moon's name is Emlyn White. He didn't bother hiding the matter, because he had to tell me. Otherwise, we wouldn't have achieved our goals. Yes. Perhaps just giving the name of the cathedral was enough, but that will still expose his identity. I'm still feeling some anxiety. I was too stiff when hypnotizing. I actually used words that were too direct during the first level of hypnosis. Audrey cast Placate on her slightly agitated feelings as she reviewed the entire operation, hoping that she could draw from the experience and lessons of today. Gong! Gong! St. Samuel Cathedral's bells chimed, indicating that it was 2 in the afternoon. Many staff who were inside 22 Phelps Street at the Lone Charity Bursary Foundation had their bodies tremble after hearing it. Following that, they continued with their work as though nothing had happened. Gong! Gong! Amidst the cathedral's bells, Klein, who had transformed back into Dwayne Dantes, once again walked to 160 Buckland Street's balcony and took in the situation of Mock's house. At this moment, a carriage passed by his residence's entrance and drove to the end of the street. Suddenly, Klein felt his perception trigger as a scene surfaced in his mind. A gray rat was leaning against the carriage's window, leisurely watching the street scenery. Chapter 1004 Third Movement Gray Rat. Klein's eyelids twitched as he didn't hesitate to turn back into his half-open room, leave the balcony, and enter the master bedroom. He then entered the bathroom. He moved at an adequate pace, doing so as though he had been repeating this entire process like a daily routine. Locking the bathroom's door, Klein took 4 steps counterclockwise and passed through the gray fog filled with ravings and roars, finally taking his seat on the high-back chair of the fool. And before this, he made his valet, Anuni, who was standing by the corridor, softly pray to see God Calvetua. Using the corresponding point of light, he beckoned for the sea god's scepter and began expanding his vision. He then locked onto the carriage that was driving towards Mock's residence, 39 Buckland Street. And this time, The person leaning against the glass window and leisurely taking in the scenery was no longer a grey rat but a young man wearing a silk top hat and black trench coat. He had black hair and black eyes. His face was thin with a broad forehead. He wore a crystal monocle and had a faint smile on his lips. He was none other than the blasphemer, the angel of time, son of the Creator, Amon. Although Klein was already mentally prepared, his anxiety made his entire body feel chilly. Amon had clearly appeared in his original form, but after stealing the rat demigod's destiny, he appeared as a grey rat in everyone's eyes without incurring any suspicion. He and his brother, Angel of Imagination Adam, had certain powers which were similar. It left terror in the mind of others the more they thought about it, but it was intrinsically different. If not for the grey fog and not for my deeper control of this place, I wouldn't have discovered it either. Klein felt a mix of joy and alarm as he expanded his vision to seek out Amon's avatars. Compared to the grafting of destiny, the signs of parasitizing was a lot clearer. However, Klein didn't notice anything this time. Be it the other passengers in the carriage, the horses that towed the carriage, or the surrounding trees and air, there wasn't any sign of parasitizing. This is different from what Leonard's grandpa said. Shouldn't the appearance of one Amon mean the accompaniment of many more Amons? He is clearly aware that he was discovered by a bizarro sorcerer of the Church of Evernight, and he suspects that Buckland Street is under surveillance. Therefore, he only sent a single avatar to investigate the situation? Klein frowned as he came up with theories. He was a little unsure of how to handle the current development. Of course, he recalled Palaz Zoroast mentioning that as long as one avatar was resolved, he could eliminate all the Amons in Buckland Street. And now, there was only one Amon in Buckland Street, a perfect time to take action. I'll first hear what the expert's opinion is. Klein immediately conjured the World Gehrman Sparrow's figure at the other end of the long bronze table and made him reverently and piously pray. Honorable Mr. Fool, please inform Leonard Mitchell that Amon has appeared at 39 Buckland Street, but there's only one. While Gehrman Sparrow made the prayer, Klein didn't stop monitoring the carriage. He saw Hazel in a light-colored dress alight and enter her foyer. Amon, who was wearing a monocle and black trench coat, walked behind her with complete composure. Despite not having any concealment, the servants didn't notice him at all. It was as though there was only air or some inconspicuous creature behind Miss Hazel. Occasionally, the female servants would look at the ground and jump in fright. Just as they were about to scream, they would forget what they were about to do after their mouths opened. Amon passed through the foyer and walked up the stairs. Pinching the crystal monocle, Amon stuffed his hands into his pockets. Ring-transparent worms began squirming out of his body as they crawled in every direction before vanishing. This left Klein's scalp tingling. He recalled Palaz Zoroast's description of Amon's parasitizing power, a plague-like infection. Hazel had been in an excellent mood recently. This was because her teacher hadn't truly gone mad. Everything that happened previously was only a test, and she had passed it with flying colors. This made her gain plenty of knowledge about the supernatural world. She learned the essence of the potions and grasped the acting method. She also gained the opportunity to advance to cryptologist. She was currently a sequenced 7 beyonder. So the world actually has such a magical side to it. I wonder when I can become a demigod and shake off my mortal coils. Hazel glanced at the hanging wall clock and rubbed her sunken tummy. She decided to get her mother to bring forward the high tea session today. After all, there weren't any guests. At noon, she had used the excuse of heading out for a meal to bring her teacher back. She also took the opportunity to act and hadn't had anything to eat. Upon thinking that, she glanced at her teacher who was sprawled on a leather cushion on the sofa. The grey rat had raised its front paw and pressed on its right eye. "Do you need any food?" Hazel asked reverently. The rat lowered its front paw and answered unhurriedly, "There's no need." "All right, teacher." Hazel turned around and walked forward, opening the door to her bedroom. Her lady's maid was standing along the corridor, leisurely looking at the balcony at the end of the corridor as though she was admiring the afternoon sky. Hazel indiscernibly frowned and said, "Guard this place. Don't let anyone in." The lady's maid shot one glance at her and smiled. "Yes, Mississippi." Only then did Hazel leave her bedroom and head for the activity room on the second story. She found her mother, Ma'am Rihanna. This lady with the same black-green hair received a pair of gem-embedded glasses with a gold chain hanging from it from her lady's maid. It was more an accessory than an eyesight correction tool. "Don't tell me that you don't like it?" Hazel asked in puzzlement. The corners of Ma'am Rihanna's mouth curled slightly. "I like it now." As she said that, she wore the glasses. As Hazel was just about to say something, she heard footsteps approaching. She turned her head to find her father, Member of Parliament mocked, coming home early. "Father, didn't you say that you'd be at the military veterans mess?" Hazel asked in passing. "There wasn't anyone there today." Mocked raised his right hand and pinched the two sides of his eyes. Hazel thought nothing of it as she nodded. "Perfect, we haven't had high tea together in a long time." "That's right." Member of Parliament mocked and Ma'am Rihanna laughed at the same time as a faint smile appeared on their lips. At 7 Pinster Street, Leonard, who had just returned from St. Ireland Square, threw himself onto the sofa as he lifted his feet onto the coffee table. Having not received any information, he believed that the punishment operation had come to a perfect end, allowing him to look forward to the spoils of war. "Old man, didn't you say that the Sanguine Viscount had many mystical items on him? Can you tell me what they are?" Leonard softly asked in puzzlement. In his mind, Palaz Zoroast harumphed. "Items of that level aren't worth my notice." Leonard was just about to press further when his vision suddenly blurred. He saw the boundless grayish-white fog and Gairman Sparrow's blurry figure, as well as his prayer. "Amon has appeared at 39 Buckland Street, but there's only one. Amon has appeared?" "That quickly?" Leonard, who had already relaxed, retracted his feet immediately and sat straight up. He became more anxious than before the punishment operation began. He hurriedly informed Palaz Zoroast of Klein's words and asked, "Old man, what do we do now? Begin the operation?" "But there's only one Amon avatar." Palaz Zoroast fell silent for 2 seconds before saying, "If there's only one Amon, it implies that he has other motives, but none of that matters. In the 4th epoch, there's a saying, there's no point crying over spilled milk. Since it has begun, we can't falter. If we delay this any further, Amon will attempt to influence the entire street. When that happens, he will definitely discover Dwayne Dantes' abnormality." Klein returned to the real world and walked out of the bathroom. He had already made the corresponding preparations. He had creeping hunger on his left hand and an emblem carved from obsidian in his right. Then, he made a Nunny snap his fingers and use flaming jump to enter 39 Buckland Street, Member of Parliament Mock's house, with the appearance of Gairman Sparrow. Control of the spirit-body threads was instantly transferred to Klein, but this only seemed to sink into the vast ocean without any reaction. He had lost control of his marionette. "This." Klein's eyelid twitched as he heard the door to the master bedroom creak open. It was a Nunny. This youth with Lone and Balam blood in him had pushed open the door and walked in, completely outside of Klein's control. He then took out a crystal monocle from his pocket and rubbed it with his sleeve. Then, he leisurely wore it on his right eye. He then looked at Dwayne Dantes, the corners of his mouth curling up. "Found you." The mood in the bedroom froze as Nunny, who was pinching on the monocle, continued, "Flora Jacobs' destiny was filled with too many abnormalities, and they mainly came from this street. This piqued my interest, and I spent some time to distinguish and seek out the source. It took me so many days to find you. I'm no stranger to this mirror, and I can control it, but I've never seen it ingratiate itself so much towards one person. This really is an interesting matter. Perhaps I should steal your destiny and see why that is the case? Ah, right. You likely do not know of its origins. It's in no way simple. Chapter 1005 Fourth movement. Wearing a monocle, Amon, who wore the appearance of a Nuni, didn't seem like an infiltrator or assailant. Instead, he appeared like a visitor as he eagerly mentioned all the preparations he had done, as well as Rhodes's origins. He paused before he could finish his sentence. Dwayne Dante's opposite him had turned into a dirty gray rat. The rat raised its right claw, pressing at its eye. At the same time, in the garden of 160 Buckland Street, with his thin and cut, black-haired, brown-eyed face, Gairman Sparrow appeared in the middle of a bunch of roses. Back when Amon was saying something highly enticing, he had secretly split off a worm of time in an attempt to invade Klein's body in order to parasitize him. However, Klein had been on high alert the entire time. He detected this attempt via the changes in his spirit-body threads, so he rapidly created a marionette at the critical moment and swapped locations. Silently, Amon, who looked like a mixed-blood youth, appeared in front of Klein. Behind him, a 12-ring transparent worm fell from the third story and returned to his body. And at that instant, the earthworms in the garden soil, the insects in the woods, the rats in the shadows all crawled out, either swarming towards Gairman Sparrow and Amon or were fleeing from this region. The main reason why Klein had patiently listened to Amon was to use that time to create marionettes. To a bizarro sorcerer, they were only complete with their marionettes. Amon still wasn't in a rush to take action. He pinched the monocle embedded deep in his eye socket and looked around, saying with a smile, "Your actions often expose your problems. To a master of deceit, everything that you did was enough for me to detect your weakness. In such a tense and dangerous situation, you actually chose to convert rats, insects, birds, and earthworms into being your marionettes without considering your servants. What does this tell me? It says that you have outstanding moral standards. You still view yourself as human and are unwilling to harm them. Upon grasping this point, even if my avatar is inferior to you, it's still easy to break you down. You wouldn't even be capable of dying even if you wish for it. Ah, right. You can stop your attempts at secretly controlling my spirit-body threads. This is because you're controlling the spirit-body threads I stole. They belong to your butler, your maid, and your coachman. If this continues, I'm afraid you will feel a deep sense of guilt. Even spirit-body threads can be stolen? No, it's more like grafting." Klein's expression froze slightly as he terminated his control of Amon's spirit-body threads. He had been patient, allowing Amon to drone on with his drivel, mainly doing so because he was secretly trying to turn Amon's avatar into his marionette. To a bizarro sorcerer, battles like this, where he stalled for time and exerted his influence in secret, should have been something he was best at and something he enjoyed the most. Unfortunately, he had encountered Blasphemer Amon, the current pinnacle existence of the Marauder pathway. Even if he was only facing an avatar, he could do nothing about him. Klein actually suspected that Amon's words were a ruse, but he wasn't able to see through it. He didn't dare take the risk. During such times, he needed the help of a spectator. For you to say so much, I doubt it's solely to think of the means to parasitize me, right? You should know that, before severely injuring me, it's very difficult to parasitize a bizarro sorcerer who can see spirit-body threads, Klein calmly said as he wore Gairman Sparrow's face. Amon immediately chortled. "You've finally noticed it. You're trying to steal my destiny?" Klein swapped locations with a marionette once again, constantly making his actual body appear in different corners of the garden. "No." Amon shook his head, keeping his hands in his pockets while leisurely saying with a smile, "If a magic mirror like a Rhodes is willing to listen to your instructions and deliberately ingratiate itself towards you, it means that you aren't as simple as I imagined. I'm not a beyonder of the tyrant pathway, so I wouldn't be so rash as to directly steal your destiny. Heh, I suddenly have a feeling that directly replacing you would result in something I don't wish to see happening. How did you know a Rhodes is ingratiating itself? Flora Jacobs' destiny shouldn't have something like that. Klein appeared on a tree. His different marionettes continued changing their locations. Amon pulled out one hand and pinched his chin and said, "Didn't I say why? I spent time to gather information and seek out the source. Oh, I went to the Church of Steam and had a chat with a Rhodes. It wasn't too frank, and it was willing to be tortured by me rather than reveal your true origins. Unfortunately, that was inside the Church of Steam, otherwise, I would have directly parasitized it and learn of everything. Even living sealed artifacts can be parasitized. If a Rhodes strictly abided by the rules, based on its answers in the past, he isn't too sure of my actual situation and only has certain guesses." Klein's eyes widened. Just as he was about to say something, he heard Amon laugh and say, "You really don't seem to be in a rush. What are you waiting for? Do you not know that my Pathways Sequence 2's name is Trojan Horse of Destiny? Although I'm only an ordinary avatar, I do have some powers that I can use, such as tinkering with your destiny, making certain errors appear for a certain period of time. For instance, no one will notice it no matter how much you cry for help. That also means that, even if you were to trigger the Evernight emblem in your hand, you will only be able to get the effects of concealment, and you will not be able to transmit your intentions of seeking help, regardless of your prior agreements. Also, even if you were to shout for help or create an explosion, the pedestrians and servants in the room wouldn't be able to hear a thing. This is the reason why I was talking so much. For an ordinary avatar, certain matters take time. Alright, it's your turn to answer my question." Klein didn't answer as he kept switching positions with his marionettes. However, Amon kept appearing in front of him as they continued their conversation. At this moment, he made one of his marionettes ask, "Since you've already completed the controlling of destiny, why aren't you taking action? You also seem to be waiting." Before this Gehrman Sparrow, who was a thin, paper figurine, could finish his sentence, there was a strong gust of wind from afar. Leonard, in a black trench coat and a black silver-inlaid cane in hand, flew to Buckland Street. Klein, who had appeared to Amon's side, immediately said, "This is what I've been waiting for." As he said that, he triggered the Evernight emblem that he had been clasping tightly. Simultaneously, he snapped his left hand's fingers, igniting the tallest tree in the garden, making its scarlet flames soar into the sky. And this huge, obvious bonfire, that would have been noticeable at a glance from across the street, was noticed by no one, be it the maids wiping the windows on the first story or the pedestrians strolling beneath the Intis parasol trees. Even in midair, Leonard Mitchell ignored this scene, rushing for 39 Buckland Street at high speeds. And at this moment, Palaz Zorost's slightly aged voice sounded in this Red Gloves' mind, "Turn back. Head to Unit 160. Although Leonard was puzzled, his experienced self didn't ask why when it came to supernatural matters. He immediately swung the direction word of the sea pointed and changed directions. In the garden of 160 Buckland Street, Amon raised his head as he pressed the crystal monocle on his right hand, chuckling. "This is also what I've been waiting for." He ignored Gehrman Sparrow as his smile grew obvious. He continued speaking in irresistible delight, to be able to discover the abnormalities of fate in this region. "It's him, Palaz." As he spoke, this blasphemer changed his actions and adjusted his monocle. At this moment, a strange gloom fell over the entire street. It was as though the entire place had been separated from reality, turning into a secret. In the activity room of 39 Buckland Street, Hazel looked out the window and muttered in puzzlement, "Is it about to rain?" This wasn't anything important, so she retracted her gaze and reached out her hand onto the 3-layered tray for high tea. Then, she saw her father, Member of Parliament Mocked, strangely open his right palm. Glimmers of light condensed out of thin air, forming into a crystal monocle in his palm. Mocked then wore this monocle on his right eye. This. Hazel had already sensed something amiss as she frantically looked at the others in the room. Her mother, Ma'am Rihanna, took off the accessory on her nose and wore a monocle that she had taken out of somewhere. The servants standing beside her all took out a similar monocle and wore it on their right eye. Thud. Hazel stood up instinctively as she retreated repeatedly, toppling the chair over in the process. This sound alarmed everyone in the room. Mocked, Rihanna, and the servants turned their heads to look at Hazel. Bit by bit, a smile suffused the corners of their lips. Ah! Hazel broke down as she let out a shrill scream. This scream passed through the house and through the garden, drawing the attention of the pedestrians on the streets. At this point, Amon had already lowered his right hand from his monocle. Looking at the figure in midair, he said with a smile, "Palez, it's already 1350 of the fifth epoch. The technique of relying on the gathering of avatars to raise one's level is already outdated." Behind him, Klein didn't waste any time as he reached into his pocket as though he was drawing a gun while he made creeping hunger turn transparent. A transparent book condensed in front of him. However, Amon simply raised his hand and the glove vanished. However, along with the human-skinned glove's disappearance, Gehrman Sparrow also did. Pa! Landing in Amon's palm wasn't a glove but a rat that had died after becoming a marionette. On the other side of Amon, Klein, who wasn't wearing a hat but was wearing a shirt and vest, appeared. He then threw out the item he had previously taken out, and he threw it at his target. It was a paper crane. Chapter 1006 Finale. In ending, it was an ordinary paper crane, bursting into scarlet-red flames just as it flew out, scattering ashes in the process. Amon, who had been looking up into the sky, suddenly turned his head and looked at the paper crane, who was a vessel of flames. He then raised his palm again. A cold glint had lit up in the eye beneath the monocle. Suddenly, the flames on the paper crane's surface vanished. Klein and his ability to swap locations with his marionette vanished. Likewise for flame controlling, flaming jump, and air cannon. In that instant, he had 6 Beyonder powers stolen, 4 of which were rather important ones. If Amon was able to make a few more thefts, then Klein might have even turned into an ordinary person. This was theft at the angel level. Amidst the extinguishing flames, the paper crane slowly floated. Backlund, Dr. Aaron's house, in a black pram. Wrapped in silver silk, Will Osepton rubbed his mouth and eyes, grumbling, "Life is just so hard." Before he finished his sentence, he took out what looked like a cane from somewhere. It was embedded with clear gems. Pure bright light lit up, illuminating the calendar in the room clearly. Today was Tuesday, 160 Backlund Street, inside Dwayne Dantes' garden. The paper crane, which was already charred and incomplete, suddenly froze in midair. Complicated chrome-colored symbols appeared out of it, instantly taking on the form of a huge, illusory, scaleless snake. The dense patterns and symbols on the surface of the gigantic silver snake formed a wheel that was connected to each other. Around each wheel were different symbols. With a sweep of the cold, bright red eyes, this giant serpent soared into the sky and stayed above Backlund Street. It curled its body and bit its own tail. Its shadow blanketed the entire street like a mysterious and ludicrous wheel. Suddenly, Mocked, Rihanna, and several servants in 39 Backlund Street's activity room wiped the smiles from their faces. They raised their hands in unison, taking off the monocle on their faces, allowing the monocles to turn incorporeal in their hands before transforming into beams of light. Immediately following that, they wore their eye accessories once again and pinched their eye sockets, either leisurely looking out the window or returning to their former state. Hazel sat on the ground watching this scene. As she shook her head, feeling the world crumbling around her, she used her hands to hold her body up while rapidly retreating. The cold glimmer in Winner Anuni's eyes vanished. The crystalline monocle was left cooked, and he no longer wore that supercilious look. In addition, something in his body seemed to be extracted as a clear, thick, but transparent and mysterious worm of time took form above his head. And amidst concealment, this worm of time quickly transformed into a figure with black hair, black eyes, a broad forehead, and a thin face. This wasn't time reversing itself on Buckland Street, because Klein and Leonard didn't suffer any of its effects. It was Amon having his condition returned to a few minutes prior to this. Snake of Fate. Reboot. Although Wuxia had predicted that there would be some changes in fate, things had happened slightly later. However, his influence that descended from afar came in such a timely fashion. In order to gain this Snake of Fate's help, Klein had not only fed him 5 different flavors of ice cream, but he had also agreed to further compensation. The outcome of their negotiation was that Klein had to think of the means to create at least 2 items that could allow Wuxia to briefly regain some of his strength while in his weakened state. When Amon suffered this unexpected blow, Klein didn't hesitate and drew Death Knell. He cocked it, gently pushed the cylinder, and aimed it at his enemy. Bang! He staidly and decisively pulled Death Knell's trigger, shooting out the control spirit bullet he had long prepared. A black stream of light flashed out, striking the illusory Amon figure with the sharp bonnet and classic black robe, the Worm of Time. This was even thicker and clearer than all the Worms of Time Klein had previously seen before. The light scattered as Amon's figure quivered in midair and froze without being able to wear any expression. And at this moment, Leonard, who had already arrived overhead, followed Old Man's instructions. Standing on Word of the Sea, he floated in midair, slightly spread out his arms, and relaxed his spirit body. Both his green eyes immediately reflected a slightly gloomy, 12-ring transparent worm of time in each one of them. These 2 worms of time had their heads and tails connected together, forming a similar loop. As the loop slowly spun, they projected a huge ancient modeled illusion behind Leonard. This illusion looked like the surface of a wall clock carved from stone. There were 12 segments, each segment was either grayish-white or bluish-black. They were clearly demarcated from each other, and the symbols were all different. With just one look, Klein had the feeling that life was speeding past him. Gong. A bell gong that seemed to travel across time from ancient history resounded through the spacious secret world. Everything before Klein seemed to slow down, including the Amon figure above Anuni. An indescribable invisible surge appeared, sweeping around that Amon figure before hurling it towards that huge, illusory stone-carved wall clock. What was actually a worm of time, Amon's avatar with a monocle, suddenly extended a hand, aiming it at Gehrman Sparrow. Suddenly, Klein saw the skin on the back of his hand rapidly dry up as they wrinkled up, producing unobvious aged spots. The speed at which Amon's illusory figure was being pulled away slowed down, but the process couldn't be interrupted. Finally, it contracted into the form of a ringed worm and was thrown towards the illusory, ancient stone-carved wall clock behind Leonard. Gong! Another bell gong sounded as the grayish-white and bluish-black clock's surface had an additional modeled hand. This hand quickly rotated a few segments, speeding up the sound of the gongs. Inside 39 and 160 Buckland Street, all kinds of resplendent glimmers of light flew out, pulled and attracted by that ancient, illusory, stone-carved wall clock. Law of Beyonder Characteristics Convergence. He had used the connection between the avatars and his higher level to strengthen the law of Beyonder Characteristic Convergence. Gong. Several streams of light from different spots in Buckland flew over. After everything calmed down, Klein's current appearance appeared in his mind. He had more white hair than black. His forehead and the corners of his mouth and eyes were covered with obvious wrinkles. His skin had sagged with several aged spots. He looked like an elderly gentleman, ready to pass away at any moment. At this moment, the clock's gonging sounded again. The grayish-white hand on the ancient, illusory stone-carved wall clock began spinning counterclockwise. 1 tick. 2 ticks. 3 ticks. Klein saw his skin rapidly recover its luster as the spots faded and vanished. In just seconds, he recovered his original appearance. Life had seemed to begin flowing in him again. Powers at the angel level are almost godlike. I only suffered some repercussions of it, and I nearly died of old age. I wonder if I can revive under such conditions. Klein observed his condition and hurriedly looked up and said to Leonard Mitchell, "How should the people parasitized by Amon be rescued?" At this moment, the ancient, illusory clock behind Leonard rapidly faded away, turning into glimmers of light that drilled back into his body. Leonard cocked his head slightly as though he was listening to something. After a while, he said, "The beyonder characteristics of the worms of time in them have been sucked out. The remaining parts have either been absorbed or have some remnants left behind. However, it wouldn't result in having an excessive influence on them." Old man said that it won't be excessive, but it might be from the viewpoint of an angel. In short, they can pray to the deities they believe in and see if they can obtain a complete purification. However, without them explaining what exactly happened, the deities might not give a response. If you're afraid of any remnant effects, you can consider guiding them to pray to, that existence. All the items that come from that will be yours. Perhaps having personally experienced a battle at the angel level, and having seen the snake of fate's spectral form, Leonard's agitation and trembling could hardly be suppressed in an instant. The people on this street are basically the believers of the goddess, so how can I get them to pray to the fool? I don't wish to be thrown into the foggy town. The goddess is very aware of this matter. They will likely receive a response if they were to pray to her. Then, I can get Her Eminence Ariana to return the worms of time that they cough out to me. I can give her some. As Klein's thoughts raced, he secretly heaved a sigh of relief. He then asked in passing, "Will there be any side effects after a complete purification?" Although he had some experience from Little Sun, this youth of the City of Silver wasn't an ordinary person. After listening for a moment, Leonard said, "A little. As it's a deeper level of parasitizing, even if ordinary people were to experience a full recovery, there will be some level of influence left on them, such as them liking to wear monocles." "All right. Head back first. Leave the rest to me." Klein nodded and was glad that the parties involved in this battle weren't the kinds with obvious destructive might. Otherwise, it might not only be Buckland Street, but all of Northborough might not be left intact. In Pritz Harbor, a black-haired, black-eyed, thin-faced young man wearing a monocle rode on a bicycle as he leisurely returned home. He wore an obvious smile as he opened the letterbox and took out the newspapers and letters inside. After entering the house, the young man pinched the monocle on his right eye while tearing open the letters, reading their contents as he walked. This continued until he found a letter without any name on it. If all connection to us in Buckland is lost, it means that Palaz Zoroast might very well be hidden in the vicinity of Northborough's Buckland Street. Don't ask us why we're taking such risks. Life often requires some excitement, joy, and anticipation. 1. Author's note: to make the plot run smoothly, the details of a tarot gathering was skipped. As for Will's prediction, a deviation happened because of Amon's ability to bore through fate. You're tuning in to the Xiaofan's Wuxia Tales YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.